prevents statesmen from acquiring a broader knowledge than the remote vision of what they see in the far distance. The state, if we venture to speak so familiarly of such an admirable reality, does not let itself be pushed around. The hypothesis that the state fissures and crumbles by hardening has no more consistency than a metaphor. It too readily lends itself to subversive rhetoric. It seems to fuel two modern myths already mentioned, that of the Titan Prometheus who attacked the gods, and that of the evil demon who uses a vulnerable detail to demolish the edifice. And yet, this debatable schema contains the revolutionary capacity of Marxist thought. It actualizes the concept of freedom, which a century after its expression by Marx remains the most subtle and strongest thing that Western rationality has developed, with the result that we find ourselves faced with dilemma, either to accept the schema, or else to concede an irremediable opposition between the irrational and the rational. The vehicle of lived experience and the concours of conceptual thought, a limited conception of freedom runs through Hegelianism, along with a limited conception of reason, underlying the philosophy of knowledge and emerging in the theory of the state. Freedom is defined by cognition of necessity of determinism, a thesis that has the advantage of combining with the philosophical tradition of logos, subject and object, discourse and reason the scientific discoveries of the modern age. Starting with Galileo and Descartes, Hegel develops in minute detail the moments of freedom, three in number. It goes without saying, the free will, individual desire that declares itself free, is only an initial moment, empty and uncertain. Freedom is confused with arbitrariness. The undermined will, the L as pure subjective activity, must be limited and determined to attain existence, to will something, and thus to be will. Decision, determination and knowledge go together. The free will, that is generally known as freedom, trusts to chance. This is a level at which the majority of people remain in practice, and so, even on an ideological level that believes itself superior, does so-called liberal thought. The freedom of the individual is the art of taking advantage of accident, chance or mischance. Nothing more contradictorily, Hegel says, the ordinary man believes himself free when he is permitted to act arbitrarily, but it is precisely in this arbitrariness that he is not free. When I will the rational, I act not as particular individual but according to the notions of ethics. This first degree of freedom, however, subjective and incoherent, acquires with property an objective and already necessary existence. This contributes to leading the will that seeks freedom towards the second moment, morality. At this degree, it recognizes other wills, it is reflected in them and reflects them in itself, thus advancing towards a substantial reality that it attains only at the third moment. This unites and supersedes the two others, subjective and libjective, arbitrary and substantial. Freedom is then defined as actuality that conforms to its concept, as the totality of necessity, cognized and recognized in the family, civil society and the state. It follows from this that morality and right, rational custom and law, go together, as do needs and labors. It also follows that the system of right constitutes the determination and realization of freedom. The world of the spirit generated by itself a second nature. Right and morality guarantee the individual against arbitrariness from without and against the arbitrariness of his own free will. The highest freedom consists in cognition and recognition, thus acceptance of the systems implicated in the state, needs, labors, right, morality. For Hegel, nothing is more rigorous than this definition or determination of freedom, yet on examination it soon reveals its ambiguity. It may be twisted in the most varied directions. Does this cognition or recognition of necessity mean accepting it, or rather struggling against it so as to dominate it and free oneself from it? In Hegelianism, Western logos postulates its lucidity and univocity, its signification, which immediately duplicates and even shatters the discovery of astronomical laws, from Kepler to Newton, did not make it possible to modify phenomena, only to predict them. On the other hand, the doctor familiar with the determinism, cause-effect, of a disease can intervene and sometimes cure the patient. The concept of cognition diversifies. Not only does it distinguish itself from knowledge and specialized cognitions, it calls for new categories. Sometimes cognition makes it possible to dominate a connection of facts, to control and thus modify them. Sometimes it does not enable this, and is limited to more or less precise prediction, often probabilistic. Sometimes cognition makes it possible to appropriate or reappropriate processes to the needs and desires of the being who cognizes and lives in society. These concrete differences overturn Hegelian theory, as Marx very well grasped, without developing the differential concepts that he attempted in the works of his youth. In particular, appropriation in the 7,844 manuscripts, where he strongly contrasts this with property, showing that the latter prevents the former. For Marx, freedom is defined on the social level, and only on this level, to the exclusion of economic determinisms as such and political constraints as such. Who is this individual? A social being, says Marx, a node or nucleus, a mobile center of social relations. Their degree of practical and concrete reality, thus of freedom, depends on the complexity and wealth of these relationships. Here, wealth in social relations is contrasted with wealth in money as appropriate to property. Poverty in social relations may go together with wealth in things, in money and capital. Conversely, wealth in relationships often goes together with poverty, in things and money. The one does not exclude the other, otherwise any hope would have to be abandoned. Social relations include relations of production, but they envelop these by superseding them. Thus, social relationships that bear the names culture or artistic production go beyond the technical and social division of labor. The wealth of social relations, a complexity more than a complication, implies the diversity and multiplication of the possibles, for each person and for all. Freedom in Marx's sense is analyzed in successive moments, enveloping and developing one another. It implies first of all a domination of nature by technology, by productive forces, then, a control of the political processes and economic determinisms thus constituted, and finally, an appropriation of the whole, base, structures and superstructures. In other words, productive capacity and organization of this capacity. In the simplified illustration given above, the doctor who cures the patient dominates a determinism of natural facts, controls the result of his intervention and reappropriates the body for the individual concerned. At another degree of social complexity, the successful realization of an inhabited space. A city requires the domination of multiple natural determinisms, including climate, water and sight, along with control of the various flows that come together in this space: energies, information, raw materials, goods, and finally the architectural and urbanistic appropriation of the space itself. It is here and in this way that Marx's concept of freedom is born and expands. But there were unprecedented contradictions unknown to Marx. Domination may lead to the destruction of the dominated, nature, among other things. Control of the economic process does not bring about appropriation, which either presupposes these two components, or superimposes itself on them, by stupefying misunderstanding and inconceivable aberration. The Hegelian concept of freedom has invaded Marxist thought. So-called Marxists have defined freedom in this way, conceding to the bourgeois fetishism of effective knowledge, accepting capitalist productivism. In practice, this definition leads to identifying the freedom of the citizen with the recognition of economic determinisms, with the imperatives of growth and the acceptance of political constraints. The impoverishment of the individual, freely consented, is seen as supreme freedom. The philosophical definition has been distorted and realized in the most unfortunate manner. When philosophy, that of the Stoics, but more than one philosopher not officially affiliated to this school was a Stoic in his beliefs, defined freedom as acceptance of fate, and even a more fatty. This was in order to reserve the inner consciousness, whereas in the name of a definition of freedom that was supposedly revolutionary because it was attributed to the schoolmaster of revolution, the state reserves the right to track the individual even in his inner reserves, his hidden resources, his secrecy, refusing him any inner consciousness and accusing this intimacy of psychopathic, antisocial, deviation. To sum up, once again, for Marx, Engels and Lenin, the revolution they envisaged, the total revolution, was distinguished from political revolutions by the promotion or rise of the social against the political and the economic. 5. If we are to believe Marx, the result of the Hegelian triumphs generating complete satisfaction by the harmony of free moments, needs, labors, pleasures, is in no way satisfying. What did the actual triumphs consist of? How should they be named? There is oppression, exploitation, humiliation, and ideology, violence, knowledge, or in modern terminology, politicians, military, technocrats. Complexity gives rise to perplexity. Which of these pictures of the modern world, the dark or the light, the Marxist or the Hegelian, is correct? A cautious term, reserving for other use the term true, a thorny question, all the more so given the complexity of the modern state, its economic functions, juridical forms and political structures, has duplicated the critical position. A right-wing critique, liberal, petty bourgeois, in the extreme case pugilist, reactionary, even fascist, opposing a left-wing critique, of Marxian orientation. A remark: the ingredients of the modern state are sufficiently diverse to ensure the variety of mixture. Is it not possible that the knowledge element prevails in one place and the ideology or constraint element elsewhere? That in one place there is exploitation without too great humiliation, and in another, humiliation rather than exploitation. Here a few more technocrats, there are stronger military, and in a third place clever politicians, so that these general concepts become operative in the analysis of conjunctures. Whatever the case may be, many elements are missing in the picture left to us by Marx. Many boxes remain empty. Incontestably, statesmen and political apparatuses, by manipulating information, have assimilated knowledge, including Marxism, if somewhat reduced. This knowledge has produced institutions, particularly those concerned with the economy, and directly or indirectly steering, indicatively, production. 10. The process of institutionalization has modified state structures, and particularly the contractual system, in a sense. Therefore, the transformations of the modern state have Hegelianized it. In truth, enough combinations between the elements listed are possible, with those in which technocrats predominate being closer to the Hegelian model than the others. Is the modern state often closer to this model than at the time when Marx only had as material for his analyses the Bonapartist and Bismarckian states? And yet, this modern state swings between two poles, a think tank or databank in the service of economic organizations and firms, national and supranational capitalist, and an oppressive and repressive apparatus, policing and military, which dominate civil society, and tend to subject this in order to exploit it for its own account. The analyst sometimes ends up wondering if these two pictures, the dark and the light, are not both equally and simultaneously true. But then, should analysis not change its register radically, according to particular materials, categories and themes? Consequently, this offers an opportunity for a Nietzschean analysis of the will to power. 6. To the brutal question, is the world Marxist, one clear in as much as it demands a yes or no response. Both answers are possible. 2. The world that calls itself Marxist, and is generally known as communist, is neither Marxist nor communist. These labels and epithets carry with them an ideology and a mythology. Ideology and mythology do not mean unreal. Once again, people kill one another in the name of ideas and ideologies, myths and utopias, far more than for realities. Both communism and anti-communism are part of modern ideologies. The so-called Marxist or communist world has its Marxist ideology. In other words, Marxism has been transformed into an ideology in the project of a communist society into rhetoric. The texts of Marx, Engels and Lenin on the state and its withering away are both numerous and undeniable. These texts may be obscured, cast into shadow, but not refuted. If we conclude, in the name of history or the direction of history, or more commonly in the name of pragmatism and political cynicism, that they are out of date, then all of Marxism collapses. It still provides a vocabulary, an ideology, but no longer has theoretical veracity in the present theoretical and practical situation. This paradox, brought to a peak, becomes a contradiction that is glaring yet pushed into obscurity by all means possible. Marx's thought, which elaborated the concept of ideology and sought to eliminate all ideology, has been changed into ideology. The radical critique of the state by Marx, Engels and Lenin has been changed. Interstate doctrine, more than a metaphor, this is a metamorphosis where has the working class raised itself to the level of collective subject, political subject, breaking the state and politics, where and how has it exercised its hegemony, substituting this concept, refined by Gramsci, for the somewhat brutal one of dictatorship, where has it accomplished its mission, not historical but universal, a positivity reached by way of radical negativity. The working class attempted this with the Soviets of 1917, and since then malicious commentators have described more than once the homologies and contrasts between the so-called socialist countries and the capitalist ones. In the latter the state often gives signs of fatigue, but this is never so in the former. It stresses its socialist character, ever more bold and far-sighted, letting nothing escape or filter out, except what knows how to follow the contours of shadow. Unfortunately, corruption has little in common with the withering away of the state, unless it makes possible a democratic control exercised from below to watch over power. In fact, the hegemony of the working class has these three characteristics: increased pressure on the opposing class, expansion and deepening of democracy, disappearance of state privileges, corruption and degradation, on the contrary, can be used by right-wing criticism, leading either to fascism or military dictatorship. 7. The theory of coherent discourse, logic privileged expression of Western logos since Aristotle has also received a surprising promotion. Not only has it changed, it has undergone a metamorphosis, becoming socio-political practice. It aims qua activity at social cohesion in the given economic and political framework, the mode of production. The state, logic appears to perfect itself and develop. One might say it engenders multiple logics, who does not appeal to a logicity, a rigorous coherence, in their statements or projects. In actuality, the theory of coherence, applied to this or that object, covers and justifies an action that aims to fix this object. Action of this kind is called strategy. Logics, of the social, of the commodity, of signification, of violence, etc., need to be analyzed as strategies, resources, objectives, agents. Dialectic seems to have been defeated and eliminated. We should not conceal the fact that the logic dialectic problem has still not found a solution. What is the exact relationship between the theory of coherence and cohesion, of equilibrium and thus of stability, and the theory of conflicts, contradictions, transitions and mobility? All that can be said is that with modern logicism, Western logos has found a justificatory ideology, perhaps the last of its kind. It is bound up with political power by the mediation of technocracy, specialized in the study of structures of equilibrium, in strategies. Now the contradiction arrives from all sides, from the multiplicity of logics and strategies that confront one another, from actions that divide up and allocate space. 8. Is the contemporary world Marxist? Certainly not. Marx has undergone a double ill treatment, studied almost everywhere, joining the ranks of classic authors in many countries, become cultural. He has been reduced to a small number of quotations, the staple of students and activists. Reduced and shrunk in this way, Marx has been blunted, stripped of political critique, as without destroying itself this cannot spare so-called socialist states and politics. Under the banner of scientificity, epistemology, economic, historical or sociological science, etc., this thought has been rendered insipid, divided into separate pieces, either by erudition, Marxology, or by interpretations, readings and re-readings, each increasingly abstract. Restoring Marx's thought, the project is defensible, under two conditions. First of all, by taking the totality of his work and its movement, instead of excluding the thought a priori, as being or not being political, being or not being philosophical, economic, historical, etc. No one has the right to subject Marx's thought to subsequent concepts, theories and problems. Second, by reconnecting this thought to the VQ, the live experience of our own age, with its multiple problems that remain in shadow, including the enormous and risky problem, what is the state, what to do with the state, in the state, against the state. To tie Marx's thought to official and institutionalized knowledge, to become against the VQ, is a monstrous operation, an act of self-destruction. No, there is nothing Marxist about the world today. No alienation has disappeared, on the contrary. Different and surprising new alienations have aggravated the old ones, superimposed on the alienation of workers, women, children, colonized peoples, etc. is political alienation, by the all-powerful state, technological alienation, alienation through space, etc. Work itself has not superseded its contradictory status, alienating alienated, realization of social being by production, be divided, fragmented, deprived of any value. We know, at the same time, that the Hegelian Marxist concept of alienation has pursued an impressive trajectory, stripped by Marx of its Hegelian obscurities, defined as a blocking of possibilities. It has illuminated many situations, despite not having a theoretically, epistemologically, well-defined status. The intellectual sadism that stubbornly opposes the VQ has tried to kill off alienation. 2. Late, after accomplishing its work, the concept, or if you prefer, the image, was already on the decline. 9. No, this world is in no way Marxist, neither directly nor indirectly. By an irony opposite to Marxist irony, the opponents of Marx, those he had killed, are resuscitating. Proudhon, Stirner, the demand for decentralization has revived the work of one, and the irreducible individual once more appeals to the other. Alongside revolution after its successive defeats and especially that of total revolution, rebellion, revolt and subversion have reclaimed their rights, either in opposition to political revolution, so as to obtain everything right now, or by completing the political revolution by the destruction of the state. How could this world appeal to Marx? He never separated growth from development. To ensure their agreement, he placed political revolution before growth, which did not take place. In other words, the upside-down world has not been reversed. Rather, it has been perfected by separating growth from development and domination from appropriation. something that Marx could not have conceived. In relation to the modern world, Marx does not assume the figure of a benevolent and optimistic 48er, seeing salvation as coming from the people and the workers. Reason advances if it frees itself from the idealist idea. It attaches itself solidly to industrial production, to material labor. No, generalized industry has shown the limits of its rationality, giving rise to world violence that persists. How and why? Do Lenin and Leninism offer an answer to this question? Like the existence of a Marxism, many people accept the existence of a Leninism, which makes it possible to legitimize Marxism-Leninism. On examination, Leninism fragments, dialectical materialism, the study of the peasant question. It is Kautsky, dragged through the mud by Lenin after he had borrowed so much from him. Who can claim the honor of these discoveries, given that they were discoveries? The materialism that Lenin counterposed to empiricism and empirio-criticism, with very little of dialectic about it, remained quite summary and brusque. The law of uneven development, it would be more correct to say, inequalities of growth and development, is envisaged in certain fragments of Marx. Only Lenin formulated it and gave it its full scope, envisaging its disastrous consequences. Since then, this law has been verified, extended, diversified, a major law of the modern world, whose importance cannot be underestimated. This was Lenin's great discovery, the essential aspect of Leninism. In uneven development, the coexistence, far from peaceful, of all levels, from the local to the supranational, by way of the regional and national, generates a new problematic. Uneven development gave rise to imperialism, and thus violence, within the industrialized world. And yet, inequality by itself is not enough to explain violence. Only the existence of the state, stimulated by inequalities, can explain this. The most risky point of Leninism, which passes for its strong point, is its theory of knowledge in the party. Knowledge belongs to the intellectuals. They possess concepts, theory, scientific terminology. The working class, unable to go beyond blind spontaneity, receives knowledge from outside. By what mediation? The political party, support or subject of knowledge, transmits this to the workers, communicating it, making it accessible, while not ceasing to possess it. Now the political party, along with the state and under cover of the state, tends to set itself above society. Experience shows this and theory can prove it. Every political party, whether knowing it or not, is Hegelian in its essence. Marxism has thus been permeated by the Hegelian theory of knowledge, positively linked to political action and by this mediation to the state. This theory has escaped Marxist criticism, to yield a theory that deprives the viku, the spontaneous, social practice, of actual or virtual cognition. The kunku and the viku are opposed, with political cognition ascribed to the party and blind spontaneity ascribed to the masses, incapable of lucidity and culture. 10. It is far from assured, for all that capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, is thereby constituted and endures as a coherent system. Nor is it assured that the bourgeoisie is definitively constituted as a class on the world scale and can survive. There are still opportunities for the working class to assert itself as collective subject, thus political subject, in the sense indicated above. Despite obstacles, constraints and violence, certain indications show that the breakthrough, not ideological but practical, of the working class is possible. This possibility is enough for the system to be unable to stabilize itself as such or to close itself in the way that every system desires. As soon as it closes, it imprisons its own. Stalinism with the Stalinists, for example. Some would even deny the present-day existence of capitalism as an ensemble, mode of production, and totality. Capitalism, according to them, already broken up into nation-states, societies, whose particularities, cultural and political, dominate the general economic features. This would relegate Marxist analysis to a kind of folklore. Another way of delivering the sentence, Marx is dead, unless it is another way of announcing the end of the bourgeois age and the coming of the proletarian age, with its ideas and ideologies replacing bourgeois values and ideologies. Like many others of its kind, this excessive proposition remains ambiguous, maybe leftist, maybe rightist. Would these theories, or rather ideologists, deny that there are such things as capitals, some invested at a particular site, others floating above national spaces and seeking a site, sums of money certified by signatures, guaranteed more or less, by a concrete abstraction, gold? These capitals report to their capitalist owners. How? In two ways: by directly producing other capital through speculation, and by being invested to produce surplus value. The result of this is not that there is no longer capitalism, but that capitalism no longer forms, as it did in Marx's time, a relatively intelligible totality, a relatively well-defined system despite its internal contradictions. Differentiated, spatialized, globalized, it consists of a plurality of subsystems. National states, the monetary system, the world market, etc. Have contradictions disappeared? Certainly not. More complex and mutually interfering, they have rather grown sharper, sometimes even bordering on the point of rupture if without reaching this is a modern world not Marxist. Then, in this sense and to a large degree, have the relations of production been transformed? No. Private property remains the cornerstone of this society, and now extends to the entire space. The transfer of land or resource titles to the state has hardly modified the situation, any more than has state management of the means of production. State property, just like so-called private property, removes the management of the productive forces and production from the interested parties, those involved in it, both producers and users. Privatizing changes little, whether exercised by a particular individual or a state institution. The reproduction of the relations of production is a problem today on the world scale. Against Marx's expectations, these essentially reproduce themselves. Yet there are many changes in the world. Economic growth, the extension of capitalism to the entire space, apart from the so-called socialist countries, the power and unity, fragile but constituted, of the world market. What assures, and how does it, the reproduction of social relations? What changes and what does not change? It is not easy to answer this. The position of women, for example, is tending to change, which does not overturn the relations of production but should not be underestimated as a deep-going change. A pyramidal society is constructed on the basis of property. Its pillars are industry and urbanization, property in businesses and property in land. It is based on realities that are established and even programmed. Everyday life, the urban condition. And yet, in the course of this vast process, the socialization of society continues to proceed. In other words, barriers fall and are reconstituted only by constraint, violence, Let us repeat this shocking truth, which is very little assimilated. The primacy of the economic, of exchange and exchange value, of production for the market, is what characterizes capitalism. Whatever the political label and ideology that accompanies this, the bourgeoisie maintains this priority in the state and political order it promulgates. As for socialism, in principle it reverses the upside-down world, re-establishing the priority of use and social needs. It thus restores, according to Marx, the transparency of relationships characteristic of pre-capitalist societies, while freeing this transparency from the direct extra-economic violence that previously characterized personal relationships. It is needless to return to the fact that the objectives of so-called Marxist socialism are basically only economic, economism and productivism, drawn from Marxism and justified by appeal to Marx not without distorting his writings have invaded the modern world. Is the modern world not Marxist in this ironic sense? It is so, no less ironically, if it is true that one formula has become universal during the transitional period, that of growth, a formula that replaces to good advantage the idealist delirium of the Christians and the famous love one another, likewise the no less famous motto, proletarians of all countries, unite one today, the dominant slogan, the maxim of action, if still unconscious, is, exploit one and fill the rich countries exploit, oppress and humiliate the poor, who take their revenge as best they can. Regions and sectors likewise, artisans, peasants, civil servants, intellectuals and even workers seek no less to draw the economic maximum from their situation, from social relations, class, fractions of classes, groups and castes mutually exploit one another in the apparent unity of society. The national state, the struggle for the division of surplus value and the surplus product intensifies and sharpens. Other strata rival the bourgeoisie, with far less resources, which continues to impose its hegemony, opposing its own optimum to the maxima of other classes. Does this not chime with the underlying analysis of Marx? Those of the unfinished ending of Capital 11, the hegemonic bourgeoisie has partially assimilated, recuperated, Marxism, in particular, rationality based on industrial practice, production. It has drawn from it, as well as from its political experience, concepts and practices, a certain control of the market by way of knowledge and the sciences, a sense of organization that has modified traditional competitive capitalism, a semi-planning. In the extreme case we find the state to be a think tank for capitalist firms, in opposition to the state as the organization of pillage, an opposition that defines a middle way, which is in fact a broad spectrum of possibilities, compromises and nuances. As has been said above, if Marx was right to a greater or lesser extent, the greatest mistake or folly for a movement that calls itself revolutionary is to strengthen the state. But have they not all followed this road? One of failure? This world cannot be called Marxist, and only in an ironic way can it be studied as such. When politicians adopt the perspective of unlimited growth in all sectors, of the power of knowledge, something that implies organizational gigantism, are they Marxist? Some of them believe this, others pretend to. We can ironically say, perhaps, but yet Marx's concepts do have a precise meaning. The revolution is made against the state, and so at a particular moment the state becomes counter-revolutionary. An assertion such as this does not incline to a form of anarchism that rejects cognition and tends to a wild individualism and naturalism. It implies the transfer of institutional privileges to the organizational, something that we can ascertain will in today's conditions no longer arise from industrial practice but rather from spatial practice, which is superimposed on industry and increasingly overdetermines it. This is the way that Marx's thought can be taken up on the basis of the present day, as a function of what is new in the world, a reprise equally different from both exegetic repetition and adventurous interpretation. The Nietzsche file 1, less bulky than the file for Hegel or Marx? Seemingly not. More surprising? Certainly, since Nietzscheanism has been associated with literary and poetic madness, full of wild rhetoric and lacking any connection to social action and practice. At the start of the 20th century, a girl from the bourgeoisie who took a lover and intended to live her own life, would quote Nietzsche. In those days, in France, Nietzscheanism stood for a kind of anarchistic leftism that would give birth to rowdy children. Germany and Austria, in the 1890s, Strauss and Mahler respectively dedicated to Zarathustra and Nietzsche musical works in a heroic and heavy style. Later on, in France, the reception of Nietzschean doctrine, if this word can be used, would run in diametrically opposing directions. Gide and Vieux La Rochelle, for example, left and right. Nietzscheanism then meant an elitist attitude, the supposed formation of a new aristocracy. On the subject of Friedrich Nietzsche, it is necessary to distinguish between posterity and influence. In the first case, his work entered into what he himself would have called the genealogy of certain men, thinkers, poets, men of action. In the second case, one misunderstanding followed another, and the influence spread in a chain of ignorance. A proper reading of Nietzsche would have dissuaded many would-be disciples. The same could be said of Marx, but is there one proper reading and other bad ones? Certain foliations particularly deserve to be studied, in several different lights. For example, the relationship between Nietzsche and Georges Bataille, or between Nietzsche and Hermann Hesse, or between Nietzsche and Robert Musil. The glass bead game predicts what happens to a society when an esoteric knowledge claiming to be absolute possesses prestige and seeks power. What does happen? It is held by a caste that resembles a monastic order. This order, dominant in one region, Castalia, but not the whole country, comes into conflict with the state and reality. This knowledge is refined and perfected, becoming truly total, mathematical, linguistic, musical, historical, etc. The result, a no less total failure. The Hegelian thesis of the primacy of knowledge turns back against philosophy and the philosopher. Hermann Hesse, however, retained from Hegel his elitism, the role of logos and of linguistics as the primordial science, and he attached to music, as did Nietzsche, a value equal to and rivaling that of knowledge. As for the man without qualities, This great book is pervaded by a very Nietzschean irony, a response to sterner, and still more individualistic than the ego and its own. The man without qualities has them all, but does nothing with them and can do nothing with them. In the Europe of 1913, anyone who has the full Nietzsche file to hand and browses it attentively will find it full of surprises. He will note that General de Gaulle, the famous and influential French statesman of the mid-20th century, attributed to Nietzsche a fearsome importance and responsibility, despite committing an unbelievable blunder about the poet-philosopher's thought. For him, Nietzsche and Germany were one. Germany had adopted Nietzsche, who reflected the Germanic spirit, the Superman. With his exceptional character, the will to power appeared to these passionately ambitious men as the ideal they sought to achieve. The fact that a statesman could utter such stupidities and make such blunders has certain consequences. First of all, an already confirmed lack of respect, followed by suspicion, about the thought of this man and of statesmen in general, to the point that it seems not impossible that German statesmen committed the same capital blunder in relation to Nietzsche. There is a strange and unforeseeable irony. A Wagnerized Nietzsche, which would certainly not have pleased him, a mythical image of a poet-philosopher, long possessed prestige and influence, based on very varied misunderstandings. There has been an anarchistic Nietzsche and an elitist Nietzsche, therefore rightist and even quasi-fascist. More recently, the return to Nietzsche, pursued impartially by historians of philosophy, has restored textual truth. Nietzsche's writings had been mutilated so as to twist them in one direction or another. Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, was guilty of falsification after her brother's death. Reactionary, anti-Semitic, under the influence of her husband, she did not hesitate to modify the meaning of texts, by way of montages, suppressions, etc. Once historical truth was restored, Nietzsche continued to undergo certain insults, rationalized, systematized, dogmatized de la Francaise, following the tendencies of current French thought, that is a Cartesian logos and cogito in full crisis, philosophers seeking to save face and make a name for themselves. Nietzsche has lost the aspect of his poetry that is scathing, offensive, sometimes haughty. The renewal of his influence, a suspect word, bearing in mind what Nietzsche said of it, has led in France to a curious renewal of philosophy, whereas under Hegelian influence the professional philosopher became the servile servant of politics. The philosopher of Nietzschean affiliation claims to be opposed to power of any kind. To a certain extent he no longer survives, he revives. He finds the mark of authority, of power and the will to power, even in language. Sometimes he goes so far that, after killing God and man, he even kills meaning, truth and finally identity, that of self with self, which makes it possible to name and to grasp what is named. This philosopher in turn professes great contempt for what is not great. Like Nietzsche, he places civilization, ill-defined, we have to say, above society and state. Does this modern philosopher remain one? If he is interested in Nietzsche only in terms of philosophy, or because linguistics has again become fashionable, a science that in Nietzsche's day was called philology, including by him, this interest does not go far. It leaves our modern thinker quite calm in the midst of those categories he believes he has superseded, but which he preciously preserves. If the modern thinker follows through, if he understands the basis of the will to power, where does he end up? This question will find a response below an attempted response. It may be that the situation of this philosopher is uncomfortable and his valor fails him. Why? Because Nietzsche condemns and rejects the whole of philosophy, as did Marx. Marx rejected and refuted philosophy because it lacked connection with practice, and could not realize its idea of man. For Nietzsche, philosophy is made up of myths that no longer have the beauty of the myths of mythology. Philosophical representations contain some myths of origins and the original. Philosophy represents beginnings to itself, those of the world, of man, of consciousness, of thought. It arranges things so that the question contains its response, being, God, soul, nature, etc. The secularized myths of philosophy can be listed: primordial being, seen from below; nature, matter, ground, or from above; God, transcendence, the idea; dualism, good and evil; thought and inert matter, etc. Denounced by Nietzsche's renunciation as an easy option, philosophy ends up with the gestures of Orpheus or Narcissus. Orpheus turns away from his path, turns towards a life that is forever lost and so loses himself. Narcissus, obsessed by the mirror in which he discovers himself, learns that he is himself only a reflection and dies of this. Philosophy and philosophers no longer have any other resource, either the gesture of Orpheus, a return in vain to the original, or the gesture of Narcissus, death and contemplation of self. In both cases, philosophy meets its end. It can do no more than generate the illusion of height and the illusion of depth in philosophical mental space. It seeks sometimes the effect of transparency, sometimes the effect of opacity, substantiality. Philosophy ends up being buried by its own failure, the failure of the human species, forcing it to go beyond man. 2. If we look carefully, Nietzsche does not fit into these categories. Philosophy, the quest for a system, the teaching of a knowledge. How to describe this frightful genius, as he presents himself? What I have to do is frightful in every sense of the word. It is not the individual I defy, but humanity. An unspeakable fatality remains attached to my name. Unsent letter to his sister, Turin, December, 1888. Nietzsche belied and dismantled every discourse, those of religious minds, scientific minds, political minds, by showing their wellsprings, in a language that has nothing in common with his own, as it is not very poetic, but that corresponds to the operation of his thought. We could say that he was the great decoder of the Western world. He deciphered all the messages, all the languages, of Europe. Nietzscheanism is the attitude of those for whom discourses no longer hold a secret. The locks have been forced, the drawers opened, the strong box is broken. Everything that there was in the archives of churches and states is here on the ground. Anyone can read and trample on these inept writings. This, however, changes only the fate of writings, not of things. deciphered, decoded. Writings that sought to be enigmatic will no longer have the least attraction. Did the great decoder have a code? Did he keep there his secret, an ultimate secret? Would this be the no code that escapes all deciphering, therefore lacking faith or law, home or place, and thus the end of ends? Nietzsche mercilessly pursued anatomy and dissection, biological terms, analysis and process, intellectual and juridical terms, the decoding, the term of a rather affected modernism, of Christianity, of Greco-Latinism, of European logos. He appealed from this to an orient of poetry and music, to divine likeness against the heaviness and boredom of the West. Since then, in the lineage of Marx, the trial of the bourgeoisie, of capitalism, has been conducted with a double or triple error. The same crass truths about the bourgeoisie have been repeated ad nauseam, and these truths have become boring. They were boring from the start, because they were moral. The harshness of the bourgeoisie, its egoism, the injustice of bourgeois society, the inequalities of capitalism, etc. For Nietzsche, those who condemn bourgeois society in the name of justice, charity and truth do not go far enough. The so-called human sciences, in a nascent state around the end of the 19th century, left aside the question of the brutal origins and harsh conditions of capitalism. In other words, the accumulation of capital, a theory that has certainly become topical again today, apropos the third world and socialism in backward countries. Given the limits of their theories and of polemical blind alleys, there has been a return by way of society to the primitive, to ethnology and anthropology, thus bypassing modern society after having diverted its study towards a moralizing rhetoric and a politicized historicity. Nietzsche avoided these errors and illusions, neither turning away from them nor around them. If he had little to say about capitalism and the bourgeoisie, this was because he despised and condemned them en bloc, not deeming to see their an object worthy of interest, and also because he included them in Judeo-Christianity. The whole of the West, since its beginnings, since the defeat of Greece, had been drifting towards what it became. The orientation of Europe was decided in the 16th century. The West did have other possibilities. After Reformation and Counter-Reformation, monetary wealth and state power were combined. The die was cast. Some superior types, like the universal creator Leonardo, Michelangelo, or the virtuoso, the man of virtue, of bold intelligence, the prince, Cesare Borgia, would disappear forever. For Nietzsche, the critique of the modernity he saw being born around him in about 1880 formed part of a wider critique of the history that began in Greece and Rome, and ended with the European barbarism of the 19th century. If he hardly spoke of capitalism, Nietzsche did not believe this meant restricting his polemic and reducing his thought. On the contrary, throughout and always, whether discussing religion or the state, economics or politics, Nietzsche dismisses from the start representations and ideologies, justifications by knowledge. To use once again this too modern word, he casts the codes currently used into the rubbish tip after revealing and formulating them. He eliminates the conceived and the perceived, the better to illuminate lived experience of vécu. He proves to those who suffer, in 100 ways, that suffering has to be endured in the name of general interest or truth. To the humiliated, he demonstrates that humiliation and the virtue of humility is their destiny. But if I'll focus my attention and my lucidity on my suffering, on my humiliation, then everything changes. The effective result becomes fundamental. The subjective accidental comes to the fore, without this lucidity implying a concept of the subject or of emotion. This is a poetic fact that succeeds the moral justifications of suffering, the ideological legitimations of humility. Lived experience grows steadily broader, nocturnal and deep. It proclaims itself, demands a voice and seizes this. It speaks in terms of poetry, song, music, dance. It enlivens another metamorphosis. Pain is transformed into joy. There is thus in the work of Nietzsche, in relation to the generally accepted conception of knowledge, a conception ritualized by Hegelianism, an inversion of meaning, a reversal of perspective. As with Marx, no doubt with Nietzsche, turning the world upside down is not objective and practical. The revenge of lived experience is also the revenge of the subjective. Hegelianism, and later the thinkers in the Marxist lineage, theorized the illusions of subjectivity, in order to reject them. For Nietzsche, the subjective has right on its side, more radically than do the conceptual and the objective. When he speaks of the men of antiquity, of the Middle Ages, of the Renaissance, Nietzsche never ceases for a moment to think of himself, to reflect on himself, with his sufferings, rebellions, humiliations. He experiences in his own flesh the whole of Judeo-Christianity, the enemy of the body. In his thought, he experiences the fervor of the great figures of the Renaissance, and in the fascination with death, a fascination over which it is necessary to triumph in order to continue to live. He recognizes the tragic sense of the Greeks, is not the great mutation, the transvaluation. Initially this, the assertion of the vécu, of the subjective moment, by abandoning the cage of the Cartesian cogito, the philosophical subject enclosed in itself. Each moment of my unique life irredeemably disappears, if it ever returns, if it is reproduced. This is a prodigious chance. Its value is infinite. ISL, no, each moment is derisory, but if L attribute to each moment an infinity, that of value, then L finally live it, experience. I can and must value it infinitely. So Nietzsche becomes a poet through dominating knowledge by poetry, the reversal of the situation. This act that can be described dialectically but in no way depends on a theory of dialectics, does not repudiate or deny knowledge. What it rejects is the priority of knowledge, adhesion to a representation of the real in the name of knowledge, to an ideology, but it does make use of knowledge. As philologist, psychologist, sociologist, historian, Nietzsche in no way abandoned knowledge in the sciences. He reverses their priority by subjecting them to lived experience. With him, poetry becomes a means and a way of cognition. He does not abolish knowledge in the chasm of non-knowledge. He studies the natural sciences, physiology, physics, the chemistry of his day, even logic, to find arguments for and or against certain theories' eternal recurrence, intermediary between philosophy and poetry. Western logos, along its route, made certain statements whose importance, truth and infinite value have been shouted on the rooftops. One think, therefore, L am, but no. When I think, L am not, and if I think, it is because L am not. L am seeking being. The thinking subject is revealed as a discoursing, questing, suffering, Subject, a subject of non-being. As for Hegel's repeated assertion, Hegel, for whom being and knowledge were identical, with the result that everything that is realized, even by force, has the right of reason on its side. Hegel, who placed at the center the idea, self-consciousness, knowledge, what a madman, and what madness. Consciousness, in the universe, is in no way universal. It results from an accident, a chance, an encounter, fortunate or otherwise, of circumstances on a small planet. A conjuncture, not a necessity, an accident, not an essence. Perhaps a monstrosity, perhaps a sickness of being, a sickness that condemns the conscious being to suffering so as to acquaint itself with misfortunes that the unconscious ignores, finitude, death, repetition, vain struggles, and so much more. Besides, the consciousness of a conscious being consists only of outcrops, emergences, evanescences. It is a surface beneath which is depth and on which is light, a surface analogous to that of a mirror that reflects and is nothing. Precious, marvelous and vain, the inaccessible opacity of depth, and the vain transparency of the heights, only leave for consciousness the place of surface or mirror, to be defined in this way, however, in their value and not in their illusion of truth. Knowledge and consciousness need cognition, full cognition, of philosophy, philology, which for Nietzsche means linguistics, rhetoric, the stylistics and history of language, the critical history of art, etc. What experience teaches, what human pains conceal, and what poetry declares, is that it is necessary to be cognizant of the most powerful of passions. Knowledge can then be disavowed, relativized without being contradicted, in favor of a broader conception or vision. To put consciousness in its place in the universe, a tiny and deceptive reality, but an infinite value for the concrete subject force is needed. What force? That of cognition. Only then, and only in this way, does consciousness stop placing itself at the center of reality and taking its uncertain reflection for a substance. It also ceases to destroy itself by considering itself as insignificant. Naive and vainglorious optimism is succeeded by a pessimism, a nihilism. No, the problem no longer centers on reality, studying it, reading it, but instead on metamorphosis. Change the real, change life, which does not mean live better, produce more, but create a different life. Changing the real means transfiguring it, in the way that light transfigures things without modifying them materially, as art transfigures what it touches, creating something different, with the elements of the real, as tragedy creates a joy with horror, blood and death. 3. In some remote corner of the universe, scattered in the blaze of countless solar systems, there once was a star on which intelligent animals invented knowledge, connaissance. This was the most arrogant and mendacious moment in universal history, but it was only a moment. A few sighs on the part of nature and the star froze. The intelligent animals had to die. Such is the fable that someone could invent. This is the start of a short and decisive text from 1873, on truth and lies in a non-moral sense, a text that not only heralds Nietzsche's later views, but contains a theory of language, a theory which, as the reader soon perceives, heralds and surpasses the most modern elaborations of linguistics, semantics, semiology or semiotics, with the result that an understanding of it would have avoided many an error or extrapolation. This writing was also overshadowed, hidden under a bushel, ignored, lost among Nietzsche's sketches, drafts and projects, the works of his youth. What then happened between the moment when Hegel placed knowledge at the center of man and the universe, with no reservation or scruple, combining logocentrism, eurocentrism and anthropocentrism in the same philosophy of the idea, and the moment when for Nietzsche the earth, man and consciousness were no more than fortunate accidents, perhaps errors of material nature in the infinity of space and time? Many scientific events happened, and particularly the work of Darwin. The theory of evolution, The Origin of Species, was published just a few years before Marx's Capital. The scientific and intellectual world echoed with the terrible blow that Darwin dealt to theology and traditional philosophy. A new figure of man in the world came onto the stage. At what moment did Nietzsche become acquainted with the theory of evolution, and conceive a kind of unity between this theory and the thought of Schopenhauer, which placed unconscious life and nature at the origin of human reality, rather than the idea? It is hard to be precise, but we should not overlook the fact that this research governed a period of Nietzsche's thought, running from human, all too human, to dawn in the gay science turned out for Nietzsche. Darwin continues Hegel. Own Hegel keen Darwin. Without Hegel, no Darwin. However, the latter so greatly changed the meaning of history and development as to remove from it any Germanic character, even while the germs remained Hegelian and optimistic. Quite misguidedly, Darwin's great work and theory were hailed by Marx and Engels as inaugurating a new epoch in science. Had they measured its consequences? If Darwin was right, then generic man, the species being, on whom Marx established his thought, correcting Hegel by way of Feuerbach, no longer appeared as the favored child of Mother Nature, who had borne and suckled him, carrying him in her arms to raise him to the summits of thought. This naturalism, this optimistic materialism, which still privileges the human being and very likely comes from Spinoza, collapses. Man is for the Darwinists no more than a product of chance. Species, in their struggle for life, generate forms fit for this struggle through the disappearance of others. The human species seems strange, which for classical theology and philosophy means that this species is strange to nature, to matter, to life, pertaining therefore to a theory of transcendence. The theory of evolution returns the human species to the ranks of nature. It may be specific among more general groupings, vertebrates, mammals, etc. Its specific characteristics are, however, rather hard to define, and anthropology is hard-pressed to establish itself as a science. What characterizes man? Speech and language, upright stance, the skull, the jaw, the hand and work. For Marx, self-consciousness, reflection, laughter, knowledge. The theory of evolution suggests a different interpretation of man. The human species signals the end of nature. In what sense? Finality, exhaustion, error, a failed species? Schopenhauer's philosophy of the will to live aggravates these questionings without giving an answer. What is knowledge according to Schopenhauer? A kind of uncertain state, midway between the blind will to live and the renunciation of life, between the assertion and the future self-destruction of the human species along with the world, between Hegel and Nietzsche. In just a few decades, the science is changed and advanced, with major consequences of a philosophical order. But there is also something else. First of all, what Marx saw as two failures of the revolution, in 1848 on a European scale, and in 1871 in France. Who benefited from these events? Imperial Germany, which anticipated imperialism. The war reparations imposed on France stimulated German industry. This was its takeoff. In just a few years, Germany made up for its economic and political backwardness. By filling this gap, it lost its theoretical spirit and replaced this by the heavy erudition of educated Philistines. The Iron Chancellor triumphed on all fronts. Did not Nietzsche witness the ostentatious rise of the will to power? For a few years, he failed to discern its political features. Like Schopenhauer, he still called it will to live. Gradually, not without occasionally letting himself be impressed by political grandeur, he perceived that the quest for power governed social relations, as much as and perhaps more so than the quest for profit, money and honors. He perceived, accordingly, that the connection between this will to power and Schopenhauer's biological naturalist will to live was a philosophical operation in the worst sense of the word, speculative and abstract. There is no will but in life, but this will is not the will to live. Indeed, it is the will to dominate. Here is what life formally taught me, which enables me, O sages, to resolve the enigma of your hearts. So Zarathustra would speak. The subject, the foundation of consciousness, is to be grasped neither as thinking nor as willing this or that, but as subjecting others, seeking to dominate, libido dominandi, grasped in the social and political conduct of the human species, and above all in the state. The will to power illuminates nature and life, not the reverse as Marx had said, though Nietzsche did not know this. The later explains the earlier. The result explains the principle. The final development makes it possible to understand the process, fundamental to his experience, which Nietzsche realized only with horror. He had already fled Germany before the War of 1870 was that the Bismarckian state, an imitation of the Napoleonic state, would serve as a model for Europe. A Europe that works with a feverish virtue on its armaments, presenting the look of a hedgehog in heroic mood. He ironically wrote in a letter of the 21st of February, 1888. This is what led to Nietzsche's thunderous declarations, first against the state, and then against Germany. These declarations are contemporaneous with the gay science and Zarathustra, the evolutionist, almost Darwinian period, which produced, along with other ancestors on the genealogical tree, in particular Larachefaucault, Chamfort, Stendhal, the cruel aphorisms of human, all too human, came to an end when Nietzsche discovered that the secret of man, if there is one, cannot appeal to and appear in the name of a biological theory. Meaning or the absence of meaning are revealed in a reality of historical order, as Hegel had declared, but the meaning appears only by taking the opposite view to Hegelianism. This would lead further, towards the superhuman. Die Frohliche Wissenschaft, the gay science, begins and ends with poems, the latter ones being an appendix to the book and entitled Lieder des Prinzen Vogelfrei, songs of Prince Free as a bird. In the first song, the prince who sings like a bird takes aim at the whole of the West, and launches a challenge to logos by way of Goethe, parodying the end of part 2 of Faust's Twelfth Spiel. Das Herreich, mischt sein und scheint das Ewig, Nerreich mischt uns, Himmel, the world sport, all ruling, mingles false with true, the eternally fooling makes us play. 2. The sections immediately preceding this reveal Nietzsche's deep thought, among them the famous section 377 of the Gay Science, Rocky Matlasen, We with No Homeland, a section interlaced between the verdict on Germany and that on Europe, cf 356, 357, 362, etc. We homeless ones are also without fear. Furchtlosen in the title of the fifth and last section of the book, Zarathustra boldly goes further and strikes harder. A state, what is that? Well, open now your ears unto me, for now will I say unto you my word concerning the death of peoples. A state is called the coldest of all cold monsters, coldly leafed also, and this lie creepeth from its mouth. I, the state, and the people, it is a lie. Creators were they who created peoples, and hung a faith and a love over them. Thus they serve life. Destroyers are they who lay snares for many, and call it the state. They hang a sword and 100 cravings over them. 112 to attack the state, in the late 19th century, meant for Nietzsche to attack Germany. He was not only homeless, he matless, a wanderer, a traveler who preferred the sunny south and its cities to the lands of the north. He would go towards the south with the Mistral wind, Duokenjaja, Mistral wind, who chase away clouds, and adopt its way of living, its values, the gay science. He wished to find health, die grosse Gesundheit. He rejected his homeland of Germany, which had forgotten life and accepted the weight of the state, along with that of ponderous culture and pedantic knowledge. Nietzsche's correspondence confirms the sincerity of these increasingly severe verdicts, starting with Dawn in the Gay Science, a letter to Overbeck of the 18th of October. 1888 sums up his charge sheet against the Germans, who have on their conscience all the great misfortunes of civilization. Each time that Europe, seeking its path, has glimpsed a wider horizon, the Germans intervene and spoil such possibilities. When England and France discovered a scientific way of thinking and acting, in the 18th century, Germany launched Kantian philosophy into circulation. Germany defeated Napoleon, who alone had the capacity to make Europe an economic and political unity. Today the Germans have the empire in their heads, hence the resurgence of particularism. At the moment when the great question of values is raised for the first time, no moment was ever more decisive. But who would suspect this one? The Germans are leading Europe and the Western world on the path of decadence. As for the Europeans who set out on the path of progress, economic, technological, they are unaware of their decadence. They will fail Europe, as the Greeks after Pericles failed Greece and fell into an impoverished life, into the desire to perish. The great lassitude, Nietzsche himself, like so many later poets and artists, then so many tourists, fled to backward countries not because they were backward, but because they preserved a bit of the civilization that the modernized countries were losing. Despite poverty, social relations they were richer. A few incidental remarks. First of all, consider the remarkable simultaneity and striking correspondence between Marx's critique of the German Social Democratic Party's Gotha program and Nietzsche's critique of German statism. Even the dates correspond. Around 1875, Germany and Europe, in which Germany was dominant, took a bad turn. The pressure of the state was both so strong and so rationally, ideologically, justified that it crushed all action and all thought, even that which sought to be revolutionary. The action and thought of social democracy. The Nietzschean critique starts from the same place as that of Marx. Hegel and Hegelianism as theory of the state, statist principle and practice as application of the political rationality, particular to Europe, that Hegel had theorized. The same starting point, but in diverging directions. The poems of the Bird Prince are so different from the writings of Marx and Engels as to have nothing in common, even in their respective critical intention. Marx and then Engels negotiated, if somewhat reluctantly, with the politicians and thinkers of the German left, with the exception of Dühring. Despite and against everything, Marx and then Engels continued to bank on the German working class, which led the world in terms of its organization and consciousness. Nietzsche, at the same time, despaired of Germany as a whole, Democrats and socialists included. The Bird Prince broke his bonds. He took flight for the South and the gay science, that of life and health, enjoyment, poetry and love. What irony, while Marx and Engels, revolutionaries and in their own way outlaws, would be betrayed by their own. The Bird Prince who sought love, madness, pleasure, the gay 13 science, would find nothing of this. Second remark, the grandeur and decadence of the Roman Empire was an obsession for entire generations of educated people in Europe, Hegel included. Every political analyst sought a way to avoid a decline like that of Roman power for his country, his kingdom and his king. Hegel saw here a verification of his dialectical law concerning the relationship between quantity and quality. Beyond a certain limit, what is formed within this limit breaks. It was Greece that gave Nietzsche the themes and problems of his meditation, inasmuch as his thought was oriented to a retrospective that he saw as different from history, to the philosophy of the Greeks before and after Socrates, to their political thinkers Aristotle and Plato, and their moralists, Stoics and Epicureans. Nietzsche put the problems of European logos, as Marx prescribed methodologically in the Grundrisse. Thought moves from the present to the past to examine it, before moving from the past to the present to reproduce it, explain it historically. The first and fundamental procedure is defined regressively, the progressive procedure then follows secondarily, interspersed with stimulating questions, as Hegel had seen and said, but without doing it, since his history reconstructed, generated, reproduced in its broad features, the time of historical genesis. Nietzsche questioned Greece about Europe, ahead of his time. He felt European because he no longer felt German. But Europe, its logos and its practice, economic and political, disturbed him. The Greeks lost themselves after a period of magnificent ascent. They committed suicide in wars that had initially aroused their agonistic, polemical, spirit. Europe could not be compared with the Roman Empire, victim of its greatness but threatened by barbarians from outside. Europe resembled Greece, except that in Greece it was a city-state and not the nation-state that dominated. Europe resembled Greece in its bold spirit, its conquering reason and its internecine struggles. At a time when every hope seemed permitted, the Greek city entered into decline and Greece into decadence, not by the decline of an empire, but by the decadence of a civilization, which is far more serious. What then of Europe? Third remark, in this late 19th century Europe and Germany, understanding and communication were disappearing at the highest level, that which makes for civilization and high culture, to be understood. References, quotations and erudition were needed, in relation to Nietzsche, as to Marx, incomprehension and misunderstanding took extravagant dimensions. Nietzsche knew this, just as Marx did. Disciples are the worst authors of misunderstandings, and this is shown in Nietzsche's correspondence as in Marx's. What ponderousness, what threatening barbarism there was in this Europe that Germany dominated with its industry and its army. What a decline already in relation to the times when Florence, Rome, Paris and Vienna, each in its turn and with its particular style, could claim the title of a new Athens. The Germans, between 1880 and 1890, were already so imbued with their political greatness, so pervaded by state ideology, that they saw no direct connection between Nietzsche's attacks on Germany and his critique of the state. He was seen as a renegade from German culture, an anarchistic enemy of the homeland, and yet, if he polemicized against the Germans, this was not because of a German state that preened itself by exhibiting its power, but on the contrary, because the Germans let themselves be contaminated by the foreigner, that is, by Bonapartism and the Napoleonic state. Almost everywhere, the procedure of nationalists and chauvinists was pretty much the same. In Nietzsche's letters, he complains at seeing himself confused by his readers with the anarchist Dühring, as Dühring, whom Engels treated as a mere reformist, was called by the nationalists cf. A letter of December, 1885, sent from Nice to Lefebvre. Among the few buyers of Zarathustra were Wagnerians, as they wanted to defend their idol, and anti-Semites, who associated the author with his sister's husband, a well-known anti-Semite, whereas Nietzsche constantly protested against this accusation and said that Europe could not realize itself without the Jews, as yeast in a dough that risked rotting before it had risen. The Germans, therefore, were unable to receive, assimilate and conceive the critique of the state. They took it as rejection of society, of the homeland, along with God in morality. Were they alone in Europe? Certainly not. In France, at the same time, there was no less misunderstanding, and no one went as far as Nietzsche. 4. Nietzsche laid siege to the Hegelian fortress from all sides. He waged his decisive assault against the three great towers that held up the system, the theory of history, the theory of language and the theory of knowledge. The attack on history began very early. The very title of The Birth of Tragedy amounts to a manifesto. For Hegel, who wrote about tragedy in Book 3 of his monumental Aesthetics, the Greek dramatists, following the model established by Aeschylus, dealt with a fundamental opposition, the between the state, the moral life in its spiritual universality, and the family as natural morality. Tragedy belongs to a history of conflicts that leads to their resolution, the harmony of the three spheres state, family and individual. For Nietzsche, tragedy was born. It does not translate a wider rational process. It is not, and nothing is, the effect of anterior causes, pre-existing conditions. It does not express a rational historicity at one of its moments. Attic tragedy was born from a profound conflict, insoluble because inexhaustibly fertile, that led to no synthesis and came to light in a unique and unpredictable conjuncture. It had a birthplace, a cradle, which was Attica. We shall have made a decisive advance in aesthetics when we understand, not as a view of reason, but with the immediate certainty of intuition, that the evolution of art is bound up with the dualism of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Just as procreation depends on the duality of the sexes, their constant struggle broken by temporary reconciliations, the first lines of the birth of tragedy, just like the two sexes, and the gods whose figures express profound truths better than do concepts, the forms of art are irreconcilable. They do not form part of a totality, a spirit of the age, here, that of Greece. What a contrast between sculpture, an Apollonian art, and music, a Dionysian one, and likewise between art and science. In Greece, art was supreme over science, and the primacy of the latter led, with Socrates, to the death of art. The conflict of opposites stimulates creation as a conflict experienced, not conceived, with the result that this creative conflict differs from Hegel's dialectical contradictions. Despite being still and always a matter of contradictions and antagonism, since every German is and will remain Hegelian, Nietzsche ironically wrote a few years after the birth of tragedy, mocking himself. The essence and meaning of these contradictions have changed radically. They are no longer thought, they are lived. Their place lies between the moments of the experienced, and the conceived, or rather representation, follows later. They are situated in the struggle of two worlds, dream and intoxication. The realm of Apollo has the beautiful appearance, surprising yet pacifying, of a dream in which sufferings become a play of lights and shadows. The realm of Dionysus has intoxication, in which individuals lose their limits, breaking the fragile principium individuationis, with the result that subjectivity disappears into dance, orgy, cruelty, voluptuousness. Dream and intoxication, Apollo and Dionysus, are opposites like the sexes, conflict and desire. The conflict never gives rise to a synthesis, there is never a third term. Fertilization yields a different being, which however repeats one of the generators, which is male or female, is dream or intoxication, and thus belongs to one or other of the worlds, without the opposition ceasing, without it being possible to speak of alienation in the Hegelian sense. Dream and intoxication, like love, metamorphose things instead of confirming them. They are not subject to the real and do not affirm it by knowledge. They change it right away. Anyone can experience them. This experience reacts on the past and makes it possible to understand the meaning and import of the great Greek myths, a procedure that already has nothing in common with history and historical science in the usual sense. In a text well known for its preliminary remarks to his critique of political economy, the introduction to the 14 Grundrisse, Marx signals an enigma, a fact irreducible to economism and historicism, the eternal charm of Greece, of mythology and tragedy, even when the mode of production has completely changed. He wonders how the Greek gods could retain a meaning after modern metallurgy had replaced Vulcan's forge, or the world market replaced small-scale exchange under the patronage of Mercury, god of commerce, etc. Later, Marx and Engels were forced to pose similar questions about logic and law that had survived across epochs, modes of production, changes in the base, structures and superstructures of societies, and consequently defied economic and historicizing explanations. Nietzsche replied to the question left in suspense by Marx, and that Hegel had not even conceived, since for him Vulcan the smith was already the knowledge, know-how, that would later develop into metallurgy. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's violent attack on Socrates, accused of having diverted into conceptual knowledge the Greek spirit that had been capable before him of inventing a remarkable way of living, was aimed at both Hegel and nascent modernity, the man of technique and knowledge, the theoretical man who knows much and lives little. If Socrates already contains Hegel and modernity, this is because time should not be conceived in the manner of Hegel and the historians. For Nietzsche there are filiations, genealogies, rather than genesis. There is no history in the sense of a quantitative and qualitative development. The attack on Hegelian history and historicity was continued in untimely meditations. Why this anti-historicism, which Nietzsche reinforced by targeting a survivor of the Hegelian era, David Strauss, the liberal historian of the beginnings of Christianity? Historicism is not confined to a discipline more or less bound up with a philosophy. It invades the whole culture, which loses any style and ceases to transmit a civilization, by overcharging it with memories and philological erudition. From here, historicism contaminates education, which ceases to educate for life. In 1873, Hegel, dead now for 40 years, had almost disappeared from the horizon, and Hegelianism was no longer the fashion. Injustice, misunderstanding. Hegel was no longer spoken of, but Imperial Germany was Hegelianizing from top to bottom. The virtues so praised by the German scholars and men of learning, exactitude of references, specialized activity, were, for Nietzsche, mere ponderousness and pedantry. The more they studied Greece, the further removed they were from Hellenism. Scientific barbarism placed itself in the service of the state, which supported it. A state power that uses history as propaganda destroys it as knowledge and consequently maintains it in a false position. The moral virtue and intellectual honesty that are proclaimed change like all morality into their opposite, hypocrisy and lies. Knowledge self-destructs by simulating veracity. Art seeks to break these chains and emerge from this vicious circle. Above all, music, poetry, tragic theater, fetishism of the iconic past, exemplary and monumental, destroys a creative capacity. Yet this subversively reappears against things reality. The state, see, historicism comes up against unbridgeable obstacles. Should it manage to define a rational process across incidents and accidents, convulsions and wars, then the problems of origin and end are impossible for it to solve, bound up moreover with arbitrary periodizations. In Hegel, for example, with an ill-determined prehistory, history and post-history, as far as origin is concerned, this is always lost for history in the night of time. Every study and historicizing procedure presses it further back, whether the object is a particular living being, a species, man, life, the earth, religion or a particular religion, etc. The same with meaning and finality. This is duplicated for example into philogenesis and autogenesis. Historicizing reason which justifies itself by history and conceives history as its own genesis postulates origins and ends, causes and meanings, explanatory connections, causes and effects. Thus Hegel postulated, or presupposed, beginnings. things. For consciousness this was sensation. For practice it was activity directed by a logic. In his philosophy of art and history it was the Orientals and Chinese. He postulated a finality, the state. As for the motor of history, he presupposed knowledge and reason, opening the way via nature, life, the body and peoples. No, Nietzsche would reply ever more strongly. The motor, inasmuch as we can speak of one, is neither reason nor knowledge, nor even practical interests and well-defined political goals, even if these interests and goals always play a role. The motor is the will to power, the quest of authoritative power for its own sake. Bravely, because unwittingly, history and historians get into a series of contradictions, whose import they fail to perceive. Even Hegel, whose logical theory of dialectical contradiction is not exempt from logical contradictions. In other words, incoherencies. Historians and historicizing thought postulate becoming, and even philosophical becoming without boundaries or limits, neither backward in the direction of origins, or forward towards the end, which avoids a number of awkward questions. They accept an evolutionary schema of time, the concept of a generative development, with the result that a coherent sequence of causes and effects accounts for the genesis of diverse realities. But what is it that they discover? Repetitions. Besides, if the same causes are not repeated with the same effects, how can there be cognition of history, acquired knowledge? The repetitive attracts historians, as it answers their call for an explanation. Same causes, same effects, and yet the repetitive destroys a temporal schema, that of a generative development. The ironic result is that historians repeat themselves because history is repeated. History as a science is thus refuted in two ways, in the name of an immobilism, which discovers everywhere the same causes, the same effects, the same forms and structures, constancies, invariances, repetitions, and in the name of immobilism, which accentuates conjunctions and conjunctures, unique 15 situations. In a word, differences. Either we then accept that the state, as the fruit of history, the final constancy, puts an end to a history that implied it since the beginning through the rationality included and diffused in each moment, or we accept that it is necessary to go further, beyond this end that is only a mean and intermediate period. Towards what? 10 years after untimely meditations, Nietzsche would reply, towards the superhuman. This theoretical situation corresponds to a practical situation. Real history is bogged down in state reality. Formerly, wars had a meaning, or rather it was possible to endow them with one, for God and faith, for the king, etc. Modern wars are no more than explanations between states, without anything new arising from the political confrontation between wills to power. Nietzsche almost speaks of these as imperialist wars, attaching this concept to that of power rather than to the economic quest for maximum profit. In practice, this society cluttered with memories, commemorations, icons and monuments, now only has in its knowledge the mirror of its wretched reality. It can no longer represent to itself a genuine future. Politicians, almost by definition, lack both thought and imagination. All they know is to continue the lines of the past. They lack perspectives. The Nietzschean perspective is not confined to relativizing the past and the present by showing that a perspective of value even determines the past. It opens up a future. A perspective is an avenue, a way and a horizon. Politicians always live and think and act behind the possible, in accordance with what is most aged, most well-defined, in the real, as Hegelians, whether they know it or not. This is how at the moment of attempting a great adventure and bringing into the life of its peoples a great idea, Europe, politicians and political thinkers erected the nation-state as an absolute, imagining that they were operating with and for eternity. The struggle, even the wars, for Europe, such as those waged by Napoleon had a meaning. A struggle between states, and particularly between European states, has no meaning, no acceptable reason. It is quite hard to reread Untimely Meditations a century later if we ignore both the subsequent works of its author and subsequent events. The idea of Europe does not appear in 1873 with the force it would have 10 years later in the gay science. During these 10 years, Nietzsche had gained a European experience, by living in the south of France and in Italy, and discovering a different way of life, closer to the great health. This is what the title of the gay science refers to: what to do against power. Go elsewhere, seek a different path, do what one can to break the machine, to derail its cogs. How? By poetry. Is that possible? How can this be foreseen in advance? Let us try the adventure, gaily. Moreover, there is nothing in common between the Nietzschean perspective on Europe and the projects that were based and would be based on those economic and political realities. United States of Europe, common market, European community of this or that. The Nietzschean project was founded on a historical knowledge. Greece, the possibility of a greater Greece in the time of Pericles, the ensuing decadence. It was still more deeply founded on the non-historicity of so-called historical becoming, in which moments only recur as depist. The return of a game or a nexus of forces in action is always possible and therefore highly probable. Such conjunctures can be recognized in situations extremely distant in space and time. The analogy between ancient Greece and present day Europe therefore has a meta-historical meaning. In any case, this long, dense succession of demolition, destruction, downfall, upheaval, that now stands ahead. Why is it that even we look forward to this darkening without any genuine involvement and above all without worry and fear for ourselves? 116 Nietzsche's courage, from Untimely Meditations onward, is not that he protests in an anarchistic way against the abuses of power. His thought goes further. Not only does he challenge the political being of the state, he challenges the politicization of the real, of culture, thought and life. And this is not only because this politicization, being tendentious and malicious, distorts information, distracts knowledge, denies truth. No, it blocks the way of the possible. It closes openings. No politics, being realpolitik by its means and ends, can escape from the real, from the accomplished. Now, there is a cut and a break between the real and the possible, between realism and utopia, if you like. The real, which the Hegelian conception saw as harmoniously united with the possible, works as an obstacle. It bonds rationally together with the state, and the state builds its fortresses on the road to the future, keeping this under the fire of its guns. It obstructs the passage. What is then for Nietzsche, from Untimely Meditations onward? The freedom of spirit that he constantly demands, above all inhuman, all too human. It is a matter of demarcating himself, as a free spirit, from the freedom of opinion proclaimed by Democrats and liberals. For them, the first great freedom of the spirit is to escape from religion, from authority of the religious type, from the dogmatism of theological ascendancy. All right, Nietzsche says, and this freedom even needs to be taken to its logical conclusion, not resting content with saying 1 am an atheist, but proclaiming God is dead, so I am alone, alone in the world, no more finality, no more truth, no more anthropotheology and ontology, I am alone, alone with myself, in the unending and goalless dialogue of I with me, no witness, no judge, even alone, without accepting either God or devil, good or evil. I cannot dispense myself from decreeing a hierarchy between acts, evaluating them, placing them in perspective. Along with God is the act of setting up as a father or manufacturing a father for oneself. No one can ever be stopped from seeking a genealogical tree, but the theological philosophical justification of paternity has disappeared along with the related philosophy. Here is the culmination of Feuerbach's anti-theology, his theory of alienation taken to its final term. 17 man rises when he ceases to flow off into a god. The free spirit resembles neither the classic libertine nor the classic honest man. He frees himself from religion, but this is not in order to have his little personal opinion, in his own mind. Freedom of opinion is no more a form of freedom, for Nietzsche, than the arbitrary will is for Hegel. The freedom of the free spirit is a political character, in the sense that it does not accept any politics but passes this through the sieve of criticism. No state, and no state decision, finds grace of state, before this free thought. Even at the risk of being seen as cowardly, the free spirit will have the courage to denounce the absurdity of violence, rivalries and wars. When bodies that contest with one another and fight resemble each other, what is more absurd than their battles? This free thinker rejects any appeal to history to justify and legitimate the actual. His freedom obliges him to challenge and combat. He will leave his country, not to turn his back on it by shaking the dust from his shoes, but so as to see it better, just as the traveler leaves a town to see it as a whole and measure the height of its buildings, to see it better, and thus to see and tell his truth, and sometimes to momentarily dissimulate this in order to have it burst out with greater force. The Nietzschean freethinker has the bravura of a hero. He is a fighter, a warrior. 5. For Hegel, theorist of logos. How is there no theory of language? This theory exists. It figures in the phenomenology, where logic and history presuppose that cognition of language is acquired. This cognition naturally has 3 moments, since language has 3 aspects, one immediate and positive, a second, mediate and negative, and a third, positivity re-established at higher level, transcending and integrating the 2 former. First moment, the initial interaction between subject and object, in other words, between the nascent consciousness, still infra-real, infra-linguistic, infra-perceptive, and the real perceived hic et nunc, the here and the now, gives rise to a third term to which reflection can attribute neither objective reality nor subjective unreality, but which retains the fundamental characteristics of both these conditions. This third term is perceptible, resonant without being a real object. It is a relationship between consciousnesses, without being unreal. By way of the sign, each consciousness emerges from itself towards the outside, and simultaneously receives in itself other consciousnesses and objects. There is alterity rather than alienation, as this consciousness of self in the nascent state grasps itself by designating and naming the other. At this degree, it is established in a relative identity, consciousness of self, freeing itself from identities by way of the changes and diversities in the perceptible. Initially the here and now, perceived space and time, then things themselves, trees and what makes them trees, leaves and what makes them leaves, with the result that designating them with a sign, the word graphic, we already reach the level of the real. Second moment, signs and their concatenation, languages, and even non-verbal signs. In architecture, for example, which Hegel deals with at length in his Aesthetics, are cold, frozen, motionless. What is an isolated sound? A syllable or a pure sound, perfectly defined as such by the tuning fork. Signs are mortal, and do the work of death. Languages serve as cutting and breaking tools, which fragment nature just as weapons put an end to the living. Hence the use of signs in magic and ritual formulas, imprecations, sorcery, invocations of all kinds. The negative moment of language is characterized, philosophically, by a vain abstraction devoid of content. This is a mortal moment, which dies and which kills. Discourse is continued indefinitely. Words link up in an empty formalism, rhetoric, verbalism. Discourse then leads to the bad infinity. Third moment, the positive is re-established at a higher level in the concept. The concept retains from the negative moment the capacity for action. In other words, subjective activity, which attacks the object, breaks it, fragments the totality, and thus analyses and uses it. Along with the negative, it is removed from the perceptible substratum, but it regrasps the implicit content of the perceptible. The concept retains from the first moment immediate acquaintance, hence a grasp of what is general and what is specific different in each real object. Already from the start the reserved element for formal knowledge. To this extent, the terms of language acquire their meaning. The copula, to be, the substantive, subject, and the attribute, quality, objective property, relationship, etc. Signs the reception and concatenation of signs, thus constitute the body of knowledge. For Hegel, therefore, ordinary language serves as a solid ground for science, a growth pole, an epistemological means. However you put it, there is nothing arbitrary about the sign. The abstract character of signs has nothing arbitrary, because formal abstraction and objective knowledge are not separated. If the sign is the bearer of some non-thing, this character does not just imply a limitation of arbitrariness, it is a definition of the abstract, which enables the sign to enter into a system knowledge, and not the discourse of language, of the system coincides at the summit with the political moment, the state, which for Hegel was in no way arbitrary. If we now examine what Marx says about language, we note that he has serious reservations about the third Hegelian moment, and his content with an addition to the second moment, that he fully accepts theory. In other words, the connection of language to logos to reason. A very well-known passage from the Holy Family rebuts the Hegelian extrapolation of the concept into the idea. The absolute idea is unity of concept and reality, of conceptual form, belonging to discourse and logic, with its content, its determination. When Hegel, after elaborating the concept of the tree or the fruit, declares that the idea of the tree or the fruit gives birth to the real tree and fruit. Marx says this is speculative magic. Hegelianism allowed itself to present the idea as final cause of the world. Against this, in the first chapter of Capital, Marx expounds the language of the commodity, the exchange of goods, the objective products of social labor, generates a different effects from the exchange of thoughts, subjective products of social relations, different but comparable. Objects, having become commodities, are the bearers of an exchange value. They are linked in relations of exchange, commerce. Practical everyday discourse thus has these two aspects, the formal, subjective side, which tends to the negative, in other words, to verbalism, and the objective side. The world of the commodity has its positivity, its language, its logic. The laws of commercial exchange, like those of logic, are rules of equivalences, which coin and money, the signs, make it possible to evaluate. As for cognition, this comes on the one hand from a critique of the discursive knowledge that is born from practice, seeing itself as definitive and bearing a fine name. Political economy, on the other hand, comes from analysis of the everyday itself, of what happens when someone buys or sells cloth, sugar, wheat, etc. For Marx, right at the start of Capital, theory simultaneously deciphers the obscure language of commodities, hieroglyphic, Marx says, and the everyday discourse of the people who work, buy and sell, and remain in the empirical and the discursive. There is no logic of signs and signifiers as such, of coin or money, but rather the logic of a certain social practice, fashioned initially by money, then by capital. Theory invents a language, that of revolution, by decoding both the empirical language of capitalism and the empirical language of oppressed, exploited, humiliated and alienated people, deprived of their own truth. Yet this higher cognition differs only in degree, in level, from other cognitions and from formal knowledge. Let us turn now to the Nietzschean theory of language. This is found in texts that for a long while 19 were dispersed and hidden from view. Reflection on these texts would have helped contemporary scholars, specialists in linguistics, semantics or semiology, to avoid many illusions. It is worth comparing them with the texts of Hegel and Marx. From this starting point, immense perspectives unfold on the whole of knowledge, on Western logos and its boundaries. Nietzsche takes the opposite course to Hegel. The obscure background against which questions stand out is perceived by each in a diametrically opposing manner. Intellect. For Nietzsche this is born from dissimulation. It develops its forces as the art of the lie. How can we believe in the advent of an honest and pure instincts for truth in the human species? Consciousness, like the eye that rules it, glides over the surface. It has no more thickness or substance than a mirror. It reflects. What ugliness, what heaviness, when modernity has no other reference than language. When it makes itself noticeable by words of its own, instead of referring either to joy or enjoyment, or to the idea disappeared, transcendent. And what predilection ensues for a dismal rigor, for boredom. To the question of whether language is the adequate expression of realities, Nietzsche answers in the negative without any ambiguity. Proof. There are many very different languages. In one language, a certain object is in the masculine gender, in another in the feminine. Le soleil di sonne, la lune, der monde. Why is a tree in French masculine and a plant feminine? What arbitrariness in transposition? What is a word? Sosa would say that the word dog is a signifying sound corresponding to a signified concept. Nietzsche denounces in advance the falseness of this analysis, which already presupposes the concept dog. The word is only the representation in sound of a nervous excitation. The object dog, for its part, is simply a sequence of impressions. The same with the stone, or the snake. Words and language only denote relationships between things and human beings. They express these relationships metaphorically. The result is that metaphor and metonymy have in no way the character of figures of discourse, of a second degree or second code that already implies a coding decoding at the first degree. Denotation, connotation. They have nothing rhetorical about them, but preside as good or bad spirits over the birth of language. There is already metaphorization in the fact that a nervous excitation, tactile, auditory, visual is transposed into an image and then into a sound. Metaphor should be taken in the strong sense, a leap from one sphere to another, the capacity to change one being into another, metamorphosis. The word is only erected into a concept by identification of the non-identical. We should recall Hegel's jokes about Leibniz's discovery of difference. No leaf is identical to another one. In truth, establishing this refutes the Hegelian theory of identity, which accepts difference only in a subsidiary way, in relation to a repetition of the identical. A is A, the leaf is leaf, the tree is tree, the fruit is fruit, etc. As certainly as one leaf is never completely identical with another, as certainly was the concept leaf formed thanks to the deliberate abandonment of these differences. Nietzsche remarks, there then arises the representation of something that would be the leaf, a kind of original form according to which all leaves would be woven, designed, colored by clumsy hands, to the point that no example was 120 completely successful. What can be said of a leaf, can also be said of a human quality, honesty for example. What then is truth? A moving multitude of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relationships that have been poetically and rhetorically elevated, transposed, decorated, and that after long usage seem to a people firm, canonical, constraining. The initial metaphors and metonymies are lost in conventional and constraining schemas, the social and political values of which the truth forms part. In other words, what each person must accept and declare to form part of a society. The Nietzschean theory of language thus establishes a connection between discourse, social relations and the constitutive values of these relations. Language has nothing in common with the expression of an ideal truth or a given reality. It is not the instrument of cognition, but a schema in the service of an order. In other words, a power. It makes it possible to construct a pyramidal order of castes, to create a new world in relation to nature, a social world of laws, privileges, prescribed conventions, regulative and imperative. The great edifice of concept shows the rigidity of a Roman columbarium. What then is this famous order, this proud state, a cemetery, which exhales in logic the severity and coldness that is specific to mathematics? The space of concepts in the space of society correspond. As for art, only the pedantry of the theorist sees it as a second and derivative activity, an expression. It is at the base base, or rather, at the foundation, of societies. Every society, every civilization, does work comparable to the work of art. Aesthetics, like rhetoric, is revealed as fundamental. The architectural spirit of man builds marvelous constructions, societies, states. This powerful constructive spirit produces colossal domes with a material as fragile and subtle as the spider's thread. The concept. Nietzsche did not invent the familiar perspective that views language and discourse as everyday facts, collections of banalities, by taking the science of language as the kernel or center of a higher knowledge, as the epistemological foundation. On the contrary, he sees language, more exactly, languages, from a sociological point of view, as an essential moment of social life, its foundation if not its base, a moment sometimes symptomatic of disturbances, sicknesses, either among the people or among the elites. In short, from its very birth, from the cradle, in both time and space, at the start of the human species and in each individual, language cannot be defined by knowledge, whether virtual or actual. It is a power of metamorphosis, which is blocked by knowledge as a definitive acquisition. Episteme, metaphor and metonymy, present from the first act of naming, constantly make a different world arise and reappear from the perceptible and from nature, the world of society, with its values and regulatory conventions, the world of lived experience. Language, in its background and foundation, is poetical in the strong and broad sense of the term. It is creative. Social practice and communication do not simply produce objects and works. They do not simply combine pre-existing materials. They create. The new arises, dies, reappears, repeats, changes, differs, from one metamorphosis to another. Between people, individuals, things, words, there is no correspondence that pertains to or is the basis of a knowledge. Yet there are relationships and even unity across language. Unity of a poetic order, on the level of values, implicit or declared, accepted or rejected, rather than on that of a knowledge common to all. If there is a fatal moment of language, it lies in the political use of discourse. If there is a higher moment of language, this is to be found in poetic usage, in the discourse of poets. While the philosopher for Hegel, the revolutionary thinker for Marx, take up and bring to the highest level the characteristics of language, the philosopher bringing them to the concept, the revolutionary theorist to political action bound up with the working class. For Nietzsche it is the poet who seizes words from the columbarium, from the magnificent and funereal palaces of societies. He restores to words, to discourse, a positivity that has nothing in common with either knowledge or practical action. Poetry, in which are reborn both the nature ousted by discourse, and the power of metamorphosis captured by this same discourse. Thus, if the poet speaks of the sun or the city, he is speaking of the same object as other people, yet it is not the same object. He speaks of the body and it is a different body. He transcends language as mortal, conventional and constraining, by rediscovering rhythms, of the body or of nature. The texts that Nietzsche devotes to language go incomparably further than Sosso's overly famous course in general linguistics with its dogmatic conceptualism. As we know, philosophers have ascertained three positions: nominalism, conceptualism and Platonic realism. The majority of them believe they are forced to choose, as constructors and champions of a system, to be either nominalists, conceptualists or realists. Philosophical knowledge, connaissance, is defined by one of these terms, thus by an attitude and a theme that are taken to an absolute. Nietzsche, however, attributes to each attitude a degree, a level. He presents an empirical nominalism, on which are superimposed a socio-political conceptualism, then a poetic realism. Empirically, leaf, dog, man are concepts that denote only uncertain and variable traces, memories, sensations, images, and do not dispense us from indicating this individual, this leaf, this dog, this man, with the result that the relationship signifier signified, which is seen as central and has been the object of so much attention since Sosso, is neither unambiguous nor well defined. The majority of words, being polysemic, imply values that permit a meaning to be chosen. However, on the level of the effectiveness of discourse and communication, in other words, the socio-cultural political level as we would put it, the concept has a reality that it obtains from language as a social fact. It thus has an institutional significance. Right, law, truth itself, wield this practical existence in a social architecture made up of conventions and values, those of castes and classes. At a still higher level, there are realities both symbolic and concrete, accessible only to the musician, to the poet, and consequently true by a different truth than that of experience or of socio-political concepts. The sun, for example, is both a symbol and more than a symbol. A glorious body that reveals the world, telling of the cosmos, centers of energies and sources of heat, cycles and returns, tragic deaths and resurrections. The sun says to the poet what the musician and music also say, likewise tragic theatre and tragedy. The sun confirms for the eye what dance and heartfelt song teach those who have ears to hear. The sun thus has a triple existence, empirical. At this level it is taken as the object of science, social, regulator of time and space for human activities, and finally poetic, symbolic and mythic. It is this last that has the greatest importance. Value. Between these levels and degrees of language, all kinds of transitions, substitutions and metaphors, transfers and metonymies are at work. On many occasions, Nietzsche notes the importance of visual metaphors, vision, perspective, point of view, etc., in rational, social and political language. This is where metaphilosophical thought comes in, responding to questions of the philosophers yet without being itself a philosophy. Let us admit that an order had to be imposed on the chaos of sensations, the confusion of sentiments. Let us 21 admit that this had to begin with the interdict. Time comes to an end with history itself, and yet this period is extended. Why and how? At the level of social and political practice, discourse is not innocent, language is not inoffensive, no more than is knowledge is, and we again encounter and discover the question of power. Philosophy has produced and reproduced the discourse of power without ever dissociating itself from it otherwise than in appearance. Only the poet transcends this discourse. 6. Does the Nietzschean critique of knowledge aim at destroying this? Does Nietzsche take the side of non-knowledge against knowledge, of discourse without law or faith against reason? No, certainly not. Rightly not. We have to insist on this. To repeat it, such an interpretation distorts his thought by precipitating it into absurdity. The fetishism of the absurd, the cult of the irrational. Replace the fetishism of logos only for a thought that swings between fetishes. Poetry does not forbid understanding. On the contrary, by starting from lived experience, it reaches a cognition qualitatively different from knowledge. This cognition of living and the lived reprises the other spheres, empirical, sociological, socio-political. By giving them a new meaning, it differs from abstract knowledge in nature, in essence, and not simply in degree. Cognition reveals the cruelty of lived experience, the implacable relations of force that make it what it is. It reveals the bitterness of combats, which have nothing in common with struggles of ideas, writings and scribes. To make possible the transition from one sphere to the other, we have first to delimit the sphere of knowledge, to show the limits of sociological logos and discourse. This knowledge, with its political use and its logico-linguistic scaffolding, has a domain, political society. It tends to eliminate residuals, differences in the body itself, the entire lived experience, by malignly confusing them with ignorance and misunderstanding and misuse, even with stupidity, that old alibi of men of knowledge, whereas this knowledge is itself misunderstanding and misuse, even, in the extreme case, foolishness. Poetic meditation rejects these reductive procedures of knowledge, and especially of political, state, knowledge. If some people speak naively, no one writes innocently. Here we can see the connection, the link, and more still, the fundamental collusion, between knowledge savoir and powered power. All writing, except poetic writing which recaptures speech, is reductive, a mortal moment of language, the Nietzschean reflection on non-knowledge and knowledge, or, as is sometimes said, on the unthought within thought and the unperceived within the perceived, is pursued in two opposing directions. Sometimes, in modernity, we see a violent enterprise aiming at the conquest of non-knowledge, its annexation, its resolution into knowledge. This is a reductive enterprise, or else, on the contrary, reflection or meditation uncovers, unveils, the meaning of non-knowledge, develops, unfolds, opens out, the non-known and reveals the constraining action that has placed it in this situation. This rather particular deciphering presupposes other methods than the logical. Does not the ambiguity of psychoanalysis result from the fact that neither Freud nor his disciples made a clear choice between these two paths, whereas Nietzsche had shown the two perspectives and opted for the second? The perspective and poetic practice of Nietzschean cognition runs directly against the Hegelian construction of knowledge. In relation to Marxist theory, there is divergence rather than opposition. In the name of a supposed theoretical practice, the Marxist conception of cognition has been aligned to that of Hegel, not without muddying the tracks. In taking up the Marxist theory, we should recall that, for Marx, the critique of classical philosophy and the critique of specialized scientificity, political economy, first of all, expand into a critical theory of intellectuality. The latter, despite its ambitions and pretensions, results from the division of labor, within a science, or a laboratories, or a team. There can be a technical division of tasks, with complementarity. On a wider scale, the social division, in other words, the market capitalist or not, imposes its laws. That is the social status of acquaintance. If the philosopher seeks to transcend the social division of intellectual work, he succeeds only and completely, at his own risk and peril. Only radical critique, which banks on the critical moment, manages a certain superseding knowledge as such, simultaneously separate, from everyday life, from the people, erected, into distinct institutions, and merged, invested in production and various activities, including political ones, becomes a property of capital, not of a single capitalist or of capitalists as a class, but to the society in which capital exerts its hegemony. The aim of theory and action is therefore to seize cognition from capitalism, from the bourgeoisie, from its state, from the state in general, from political use, which presupposes first of all that specialism is rejected as a criterion, as superior to the non-specialized, to the everyday, to global cognition, and subsequently that we rediscover somewhere, in the concept or in the social, an intellectual subject. How? By class struggle waged on every site, on every level, in every domain. Marx replies. We could also reply in a Nietzschean vein, by changing the meaning and center of cognition, by employing analysis to reveal what is hidden in all the activities of society where cognition is twisted by hegemony, where it exerts its power over knowledge, with knowledge, by decoding the messages of both non-knowledge and knowledge, by understanding non-knowledge as such, without reducing it, by revealing the underlying value so as to bring them to light, sometimes to take them into account, sometimes to reject them, after passing them through the sieve of an attentive but friendly critique. If Western knowledge logos up with material growth, economism, productivism, quantitativism, the question raised above and Nietzsche's reply to it are completely valid. However, this dismisses logos, which Marx and Marxist thought fundamentally accept as a social gain, liberating it from its capitalist and bourgeois trammels. It is not certain that the centering of logos can consist simply in a work on language, and a literary practice. In the Nietzschean line of argument, it is necessary to go further, to replace the fetishism of logos and its rhetorical unconscious by the fetishism and rhetoric of desire. This half-baked project again does not correspond to the Nietzschean perspective. Here too, recourse to the Hegelian thesis makes it possible to get our bearings and locate the Nietzschean perspective. Remember that, for Hegel, need has a positive existence, a rational being. It corresponds to an object, to productive work. No need exists in isolation, or returns to the immediacy of natural desire. Needs, therefore, constitute a rational ensemble, a system that enters into the workings of the systems of civil society within the state. The system of needs and systems of work correspond to one another. Each need defines a satisfaction. It consumes an object, one that is reproducible. The conditions of this producibility is bound pertain to political economy, insofar as they go beyond the immediately natural. Needs are abstract and social, one going together with the other. Today we would say that they are sophisticated. As for desire, it fails to emerge from the immediacy described in the phenomenology. Desire to desire and be desired. It destroys the desired object, devours and brutalizes it, it destroys itself, with no other trace than its ravaging. In a burst of mad enjoyment, thought and desire led towards a bad infinity, romantic rhetoric, ceaseless verbiage, irrational delirium. Marx, against desire, he chooses need, although he puts it in brackets in order to analyze exchange value. Need and use are connected. The Marxist critique of labor does not extend, with Marx, to the critique of need, despite touching on this here and there. Despite certain reservations in the 7,844 manuscripts, there is no disagreement on this point between Hegel and Marx, who accepts the rationality of Western society, limited because bourgeois, but nonetheless real. Over the last century, Marxist reflection has avoided this reef. A surreptitious division may be noted, should needs be limited. The position of certain Trotskyists, or expanded indefinitely, the position of the productivists, or should their artificiality be combated, the position of moralists, humanists and naturalists. With Nietzsche, a different perspective opens. Desire and lived experience, misunderstood and not knowing, itself pertain to poetry. The initial desire and final result, we might say, of an explosive expenditure of energy. A certain energy, quantifiable, though this is not so important, is focused at a center, on a subject, but this energy exists only by acting, producing an effect. The living or thinking being expends it in games and struggles, as well as in work. They waste it frenetically. Needs. These are calm investments and rewards of vital energy. What shapes them? Language, the socio-political architecture, the political power and ideological pressure that are exerted on desire, and work. As for profound thought, in scare quotes, as Nietzsche ironizes and mistrusts as soon as the conscious being emerges from the surface, the scintillating mirror, the poet alone being able to soar. Nietzsche's thought seems to be as follows, at least until the gay science. Initially the profundity of the body, of explosively accumulated energy, of physiological phenomena, is shapeless. Accidents play a predominant role. Two procedures enable a certain order to be introduced into this initial and fundamental chaos. Language brings the logic that simplifies, and judgment and appreciation bring the ethical or aesthetic value that makes choice possible. Then a social life can function. Need rules, whether determined or free. Grand desire gathers the energy scattered into various needs and activities, determined by logical conventions and moral evaluations. Grand desire differs from initial desire in the way that altitude differs from the deep shadow beneath the surface. Initially, desire is unconscious and expended without consideration, gathered and condensed. Creative energy is not wasted, does not produce just any chance object, is not lost by destroying at random. Grand desire is the desire of the superhuman. It is already the superhuman, its presence and its birth. It plays, but the rules of its game are in no way puerile. It destroys, without barbarity. It reaches the highest consciousness, that of overcoming. Überwinden. In other words, it is destroyed, consumed, transcended. Grand desire includes cognition. It combines this with art, and above all with the art of living. It advances far beyond what we know. We human, too human. 7. The concept, or rather, the concept image, of the will to power has a certain relationship to the mortal struggle of consciousnesses according to Hegel. Nietzsche repeatedly said that every German is in some part Hegelian, and consequently has their share of violence. In the phenomenology, self-consciousness is born from reciprocal action between consciousnesses. In the embryonic state, this painful birth does not happen without struggle. Emergence above the immediate, nature, the unconscious, into abstraction and reflection self-consciousness, implies a struggle to the death, in the course of which, more exactly, at the end of which, each actor comes to be known and recognized by the other, and consequently reflects, recognizes, themselves. A game of mirrors, a play on words, a sleight of hand? Not at all. And there is nothing erotic in Hegelian thought. Conflict is necessary for emergence. Master and slave confront one another arms in hand. Knowledge benefits from this, but the philosopher learns only later, perhaps too late. Does the class struggle, as seen by Marx, continue the Hegelian concept of the mortal struggle of consciousnesses? Yes and no. No. As for Marx, these struggles have precise historical conditions. In antiquity, the Middle Ages, or capitalism, the struggle is not a phenomenological moment of consciousness in general. No. As the confrontation takes place between classes and not between speculative subjects, master and slave. No. As the struggle does not have as its reason and end recognition of self in the other, of the other in oneself, of oneself, but ownership of the means of production and the social surplus product. And yet, yes, as the class struggle waged to the end educates the consciousness of the subjected, changes this into cognition, and sooner or later overthrows the situation to the benefit of the workers. The Nietzschean will to power differs from this struggle to death of consciousnesses inasmuch as it is not a moment, it is permanent, and not superseded in the course of a history. Knowledge itself serves the will to power. It is not overthrown. If the slave rebels against the master, if he risks death once again in order to conquer, it is because the will again becomes stronger than the memory the ressentiment defeat, and that he has invented values that impel him to combat rather than to acceptance. The struggle does not lead to a mutual and reciprocal recognition, but to a victory over yesterday's conquerors, or to a defeat of the rebels, often to a contagion or contamination of the conquerors by the values of the conquered. The oppressed, the conquered, are not thereby deprived of the will Zermacht. They are simply the weaker, sometimes just for a while. Women, for example. Nietzsche attempted an ontology of the will to power, contained in the book that falsely bears this title, as he planned to call it the innocence of becoming. This ontology is only very little removed from a rationalization or theorization accepting the given, the reality, that are envisaged. It is true that the will to power expresses the vital energy that acts in the body. This energy is accumulated and expended in various ways, most commonly with violence, except in cases where it is contained and maintains its tension, refining this and thereby attaining the levels of concentration at which it finds plenitude and joy. In poetic creation, in pleasure, the will assumes a tension that by successive degrees and measured rhythms mounts the slope leading it to the summit. Moments of relaxation and expenditure, the surging burst, deliverance, self-destruction, perhaps orgasm. The theory of the will to power, accordingly, relates to an energy that is fundamental yet complex. What it faces is exclusively other wills to power, other energies, diverse in their unity and reciprocal relationship. It reigns on the socio-political level. In the struggle for state authority, we can recognize the will to power in what might be called a pure state, since it sees only itself. But this recognition intensifies the struggle instead of superseding it. In the state, the will reveals itself, unveils itself, strips itself bare. But it is also found elsewhere, in all relationships, between man and woman, children and parents, as between oppressors and oppressed, bosses and workers. For Nietzsche, all that profit contributes to the will to power is a pretext, a stimulant, a means. The same goes for logic. Identity represented, named, taking responsibility for and imposed, serves the will to power, in a way privileged by language. The will to power cannot be attributed simply to establish authority. This resembles pleasure in its capacity for destruction, abuse, immoderate yawn, mad ambition, etc. What defines the will's act is, 22 more the conquest of power than power itself. In the course of this conquest, the will to power prodigiously invents, masks and disguises, virtue, disinterestedness, charity, and means, the values that enable it to establish itself and to command and organize things. The concept of the will to power thus brings with it a conception of the world, an interpretation, a global perspective, what for a long while would be called a philosophy. How should we describe its genealogy? It is most commonly related to the influence of Schopenhauer on Nietzsche, the vitalist philosophy of wishing to live. That did indeed inspire the birth of tragedy, if Nietzsche's works are not taken in isolation, and the later are used to illuminate the earlier. In other words, if 10 years of life and creation through to the explosion of joy of the gay science and Zarathustra are taken into account, we open up a very different perspective. Nietzsche reveals the subterranean currents of European consciousness, opposed to logos, cast into the shadows by the official rationalism of philosophy and state. Courtly love, itself the foundation of the gay science, Augustinianism, with its triple libido including the libido dominandi and finally the great heresy that opposes the crushing paternity of the law, criticizes the primacy of logos, the word, and awaits the advent of the spirit, the heresy of Abelard and of Joachim de Fiore. This is the fundamental point, by which Nietzsche is descended from other ancestors than the Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian philosophers. Poetry redeems it, manifests the power of metamorphosis that is revealed in appreciation, judgment, evaluation, as well as in play and art. With poetry, physical and vital energy is superseded. In the Nietzschean sense, vital energy, the will to power, is superseded not by killing itself off but by overcoming itself and asserting itself in a different sphere. Poetry. This is born at the moment of redemption. The poet, like any creator but better than other artists, renounces and denounces the will to power, overcoming it. The superhuman transcends the human, and first of all the will's act, which has made men and the inhuman relations between them. Does Zarathustra withdraw into solitude so as to put to death his will to power, to deny his will to live in the way of a Schopenhauerian ascetic? On the contrary, he exalts his being, finally revealed, and his dialogue with the sun expresses this revelation and exaltation. The Nietzschean analysis of the will to power does not claim to annul sexuality and its problems. It does not put them in the foreground. The theory tends to consider the sexual domain, libido sentienti, not as a sphere of causes and reasons, but as one of effects and consequences, what a human being has undergone elsewhere, by the effect of power, of the abuse of authority, privations and humiliations, in all other spheres, is translated into the sexual domain by complementary and supplementary frustrations, which are effects at least as much as causes. 8. As for Nietzscheanism, there is no such thing. There is a Hegelianism, but there is not just one Marxism, and there is not a Nietzschean theory, of the will to power, or of the superhuman, or of eternal recurrence. There is a Nietzschean practice, identical neither with the Hegelian practice of knowledge, theoretical practice, nor with political practice. In other words, dialectically and in principle anti-political, poetic practice, or rather poietic practice, values lived experience to the detriment of the conceived and perceived, overvalued by Western logos. It transcends the will to power by an act that does not metamorphose the real into the surreal, an artificial and impotent operation, but rather the human into the superhuman. The superhuman, far from pressing the taste for power to the extreme, on the contrary redeems themselves from it, so inaugurating a different light, a different horizon, a different world. Does this perspective imply a more precise project, tending to make the impossible possible? Perhaps, the destruction of reality, of the subject in the sense of Western logos, the cogito, of identity that serves an authority, norms and values established by authority, in short, radical subversion. This perspective can be seen as a project, but it is insufficient. It emphasizes a great risk of death, nihilism. The superhuman is not satisfied with helping the self-destruction of modernity, of the state, of the people, classes, in power. He seeks to draw something else from dissolution, an affirmation. Instead of demolishing point by point, place by place, or simply denying and contradicting the existing order, he wants to found, what? An ethic? Certainly not doubt an aesthetic, not that either. A way of living that would supersede ethics and aesthetics, founded on what? Perhaps on an agreement between Dionysus and Apollo, irreducible yet inseparable, to become heroic in the course of a vain combat, to work out that consciousness gaining consciousness can demolish authority as a spiritual force, is not the Nietzschean madness, no more than referring to something deep, desire, the unconscious. Nietzsche adopts neither the Western attitude, critical ratiocination, nor the Eastern one, sovereign detachment, renunciation and contemplation, bound up with an ontology. Instead of this, struggle. But what struggle? The one he has waged with his weak means, and the tactic of engaging as cleverly as the powerful, undoing the game of power and playing with it, dodging the blows, and so arriving at a strategy that connects with certain means, poetic writing, or even certain forces. One that does not include violence, but does not exclude it. The simple use value of things, apart from their value in exchange, wealth and power, to the realists. You sober people who feel armed against passion and fantastical conceptions unto two in your unveiled condition still most passionate and dark creatures, compared to fish 9. What is there in common between the Nietzschean theme of ressentiment and the Hegelian concept of alienation, which Marx detached from the Hegelian system and took over in order to elucidate social practice? Man, for Nietzsche, does not live as a being of need or desire, but rather of ressentiment. This term has a far stronger meaning than the trivial one. To resent something, a sentiment, an impression, a past situation, which the subject seems and believes itself to have emerged from, has left its traces in the unconscious, perhaps, unless these traces constitute the unconscious itself. They do not coincide exactly with memory. Ressentiment differs from recognition. The initial situation is relived, repeated. It returns and its remembering makes it obsessive, pregnant, determinant. Simultaneously, the subject allows itself to be attached to the situation and actively does so. It turns away from the present and revives the past. It flees the actual, unable to live it. Its vehicle is located far back, deeply back. Did Nietzsche anticipate psychoanalysis? To a certain point, indeed, but his theory goes deeper. What produces ressentiment is not some mental event, a lack, a pain. It is always or almost always a humiliation. It is in this way that Nietzsche pursues an in-depth excavation of the concept of alienation. The ressentiment of the being alienated by humiliation has something irreparable, irremediable, irreversible about it. Why not? Because it amounts to denying one's humiliation, finding a singular pleasure in it, and above all, drawing from it a virtue, humility. People make themselves humble, virtuous, in order to accept humiliation and change it into a disturbed happiness. They seek the humiliating situation, or something similar to this. They offer themselves as victims, prey, objects, to the will to power that has trampled them. Humanizing and optimistic rationalism accepted that a total de-alienation would erase the initial alienation, and could be accomplished by a reverse process to this alienation. For Hegel, the absolute idea reabsorbs the initial alienation by which the world emerges from its womb. It even reprises the world as a kind of test, charged with knowledge. The slave can conquer the master and supersede, in the Hegelian sense, the situation of defeat. Similarly for Marx, productive, industrial work, managed and reorganized by the working class, will suppress alienating and alienated labor, divided and imposed as a foreign force. Nietzsche no longer believes that concrete alienation, humiliation, severe deprivation can disappear without indelible traces. The oppressed, the subjected, will have generated within themselves values that enabled them to live, by concealing from themselves or even, which anyway comes to the same thing, accepting the conditions of their life. Abasement becomes a raison d'etre, with compensations, complications, explanations, justifications. It marks out a place, the site of a hierarchy, as if by chance. Every humiliated individual has others below him that he can belittle. Women, children, animals, outcasts. The offended party comes to define himself in his own eyes by the moment of humiliation, the homage paid to the powerful, loyalty, devotion, etc. In conditions of modernity, men of ressentiment proliferate. Everyone resents everyone else. Those who want power to revenge themselves on the existing power do not escape this destiny. They maintain it. In the same way as there are men of ressentiment, there are also women, perhaps all women. Instead of blaming morality and religion, which pretend to protect them, for their misery, they attack men, males, diverting the question. 24 Taking together, the offended and humiliated establish a vicious circle, a deadly ring, a tourniquet. They increase the repetition of the resented experience, directly or otherwise. It is the only thing that they speak of. Who? Women in particular, believers, the subjects of a monarch or any government, of a state, workers, perhaps, slaves, always. If the masters have known how to handle their domination, ressentiment provides a secret of accepted slavery, preferred to death. Culpability is therefore a state, rather than the consequence of a definite act. This state ravages the West, under the sign of the state. The sense of being at fault, original or derisory, mortal or venal, is linked with ressentiment as a source of anxiety that demands explanation. Occasions for culpability are not lacking. Wars, harmful activities, and so many others. But the fundamental character this culpability escapes Europeans, so enabling religious spirits, philosophers or politicians to exploit the feeling that is unaware of itself as ressentiment, a poison of consciousness. The problem for Nietzsche, moreover, is not so much to diagnose or explain the sense of culpability and its poisoned source, ressentiment, as to show the way to curing it. The aim is health, the great health that overcomes the great sickness, the nihilism to which ressentiment leads. What is the path to rediscovering health? Return to nature? No. On the contrary, to overcome both nature, that is, the will to power, and the test of becoming, ressentiment and culpability. Instead of a historical time strewn with victories and defeats, aggressions and humiliations, the gay science illuminates the innocence of becoming. It does not follow a path prefabricated by a providence or arranged by a hidden rationality. It proceeds by chance. There is neither responsibility nor culpability for the individual in general, which in no way dispenses us from drawing up a charge sheet against certain individuals, the powerful. 10. At the same time as Hegel and Marx, asserting Kierkegaard placed a stumbling block on the path of becoming, of progress, repetition. Soren Kierkegaard introduced the paradox in a manner that is rightly seen as mystical. Kierkegaardian repetition, that which Job on his dunghill requests of God, after he has lost everything, that which Kierkegaard demands for his shattered love of Regine, exorcises time, that diabolical marvel. By invoking the eternal, God can bring back the dead, suspend time, wind it back, and that is why God can restore what has been lost, original innocence, worldly goods. Job, the beloved Kierkegaard. At the center is transcendence. The paradox of repetition is likewise introduced by this. As early as the War of 1870-1, Nietzsche proclaimed that history, reason and knowledge were drowning in an ocean of mud and blood. First repetition, the violence whose necessity seems obvious to the men who take decisions and whose absurdity seems no less obvious to those who experience it, but it is particularly on the basis of poetry, music and theatre, tragedy, that Nietzsche highlights the repetitive. We could study here how in his prose and his poems he uses classical procedures, all proceeding from repetition, rhyme, alliteration, recalls, syllables and key words. His poetry does not imitate music. It does not seek to be musical. It does not bend language to the laws of another art. It brings into language what has been achieved in music. Music is based on repetition. Everything in it is repetitive, not only its themes, the Wagnerian leitmotif, the theme of the fugue, etc., but also notes, intervals, timbres, rhythms, measure, etc. And yet, in relation to music, everyone speaks of freshness, movement, rushing, streaming, constant invention and even temporality. No repetition without difference, and no difference without repetition. As for tragedy, it goes even further in repetition. It resuscitates the hero by way of a prepared and rehearsed text. The tragic act, the mortal moment, the Holocaust, is recommenced in a place devoted to this rite. It is relived with a difference. Tragic joy. Nietzsche puts the repetitive at the center of his reflections. Instead of becoming, not exactly. The problem is precisely to understand how there is becoming in repetition and repetition in becoming. For Nietzsche, the ancient image of the Heraclitean flux comes up against the repetitive, but the repetitive cannot be taken in isolation, as pure repetition, taken by itself, arbitrarily isolated, it makes becoming incomprehensible. Now, there is time, and even a multiplicity of times, rhythms, lineages, cycles, and a prodigious diversity of creations of becoming, but there are repetitions within time. This is the paradox that seems to elude science. Nietzsche, without disavowing science, places himself on the border between the conceived and the experienced, and thus between science and non-science, on the crest. This non-science is of iku, joy and suffering, ever repeated, ever new, divine laughter, the dance of the gods, the gay science, transgresses the viku better and more than does sad science. This is poetry. This is the intoxication of becoming and of repetition. Return with all your torments. That is how the yes to living is uttered. Do we want to begin with knowledge instead of beginning with a critique of knowledge, with music, tragedy, poetry? That is possible, despite being the opposite path to that of Nietzsche. He never systematized the elements of his thought, on the so-called philosophical level. To systematize him is thus to traduce him. Here and now we are going to traduce Nietzsche, lucidly, the better to show him by his wrong side, as we might say, and the better to display him. For Nietzsche, difference is essential, although this term does not fit exactly. How can the importance of difference be demonstrated against those who challenge it? Rationalists, people of the state, the repetitive is the identical, and it is the very principle of logical identity. A equals A. This formal principle implies a repetition, as close as possible to absolute repetition, and yet this second A cannot repeat the first absolutely and in a total fashion, simply because it is second. Formal logic is involved here, and the series of numbers, in other words, mathematics, 1 plus 1 equals 2. A repetition generates a difference. The smaller the difference, with the least content, the minimum is the residue. So it is transparent, and yet, from one operation to another, one repetition to another, an infinity is created. The infinite set of whole numbers, a set within which every difference is minimal, makes it possible to generate other infinite sets, fractions, transcendental numbers, etc., and to extract the concept of infinite, transfinite, number. Between infinite numbers the differences are maximal. Pure logic is logically superseded. The repetitive is the generation of numbers, and therefore of sets, of space and spaces. The infinite is generated on the basis of repetition, by concepts that today are almost fully elucidated, series and recurrences, sets, the transfinite, the power of continuity, the numerable and non-numerable, the set of sets. The greatest difference, infinite finite, is perceived and grasped in this way, but the repetitive overflows the field of numbers. It extends to gestures, to practical acts that are reiterated. Linear repetition covers an immense field, on condition that we accept what it is not possible to accept. The repetitive generates the differential, but conversely, the differential is produced by repetition, in the course of a specified time. Knowledge, therefore, and repetition itself, memory, reiterated operations, logic, etc., is knowledge of the repetitive, just as work consists of repeated gestures. Does this field, this immense domain of the repetitive, come to a close? No. The repetitive is also the doubling and redoubling, thus duplication and duplicity, thus symmetry and asymmetry. The mirror and mirror effects, mirage effects, echo, reflection, image. And why not the mask, the deceptive reflection? The repetitive is again revealed in memory, thus with all cognition. Cognition means recognition, reminiscence. The bitter counterpart is ressentiment. Does not language itself have to be attributed to the linear repetitive, the repetition, in combination, of articulated sounds? Do not mental realities have to be located here? Self-consciousness, doubling, duplication, duplicity, and its basis or foundation in the body, the unconscious, with their reciprocal interactions, calls and recalls, but the repetitive divides in its turn, linear cyclical. The cyclical is rhythm. Rhythms, those of the living being. Who says rhythm? Says repetition. On the moving boundary between the linear and the cyclical, there is the unconscious. Every living body receives information, from the cell to the human being, and it decodes only a tiny part of this plethora of messages. The theory of messages and codes, redundancies and variations of information, belongs to the theory of repetition. The living body has a double character. Massive energies are distributed and expended according to cycles and rhythms. Energies that are fine, informational, relational, situational, linear messages, both coded and decoded. The double character of the living body is a function of the double character of repetition, linear and cyclical. This is not all, not yet the all. If reflection examines examines the world, it discloses the cycles of the seasons, of life and death, Dionysus and his powers, the path through tests, tragic demises and resurrections. If reflection examines the cosmos, it reveals light, Apollo, dream and clarity, energy, the foundation of being, spreads out. The law of energy is to be expended. It is dispersed by squandering itself. The energy game is played by way of the cycle leakage concentration. Energy establishes centers, nuclei, foci. Around these, spheres and systems dart in this from the tiny particle through to galaxies, from the micro to the macro. Always attention, a will to action, thus to power, which spreads, whether generous or brutal. The sun has the triple existence. Already recognized, empirical, socio-political, symbolic, poetic. Likewise, the small focus of the living body, the subject, the brain and its periphery. Here is the famous subject, a center, not a substance, a small center of impulses, desires, in a word, of energies, which expend and disperse themselves, not without leaving traces. Here, reflection shifts while dancing on the edge that separates knowledge from non-knowledge. On one side of the divide, it is ironic that, starting from knowledge, and generating it by the repetitive, reflection ends up living as non-knowledge. We have knowledge generated, generating itself by repetition. On the other, we have the Viku indifferent to this genesis, but receiving from this difference another dimension, which itself is to be cognized and recognized, living, joy, bodily pleasure, anxiety, trance and dance, tragedy, the resurrection of heroes, denial of time by represented repetition, music, the upsurge and resurrection of joy, inseparable from pain, death, which is repeated with life. Finally, history with its problematic, uncertainties and certainties, memory and knowledge, tomb of time past and recall to light, encumbrance and yet solicitation, knowledge banks on the least difference, and art, in contrast, on maximal differences irreducible to those induced within any kind of ensemble, system or logic. What then of the future in the Nietzschean perspective? It is the totality of the cyclical and the linear. Evolutions and revolutions, the same and the other dart the identical and the different, and their reciprocity, their generation. Hence the obscure and the intelligible dart mythical thought and rational thought, the world and the cosmos, Dionysus and Apollo, subterranean labyrinths and hillsides in the light of day. Philosophy dart freed from the metaphysical, metaphorical apparatus, the secretion of bureaucracies, ecclesiastical, political. It is here, reprised entirely, but on a different level, in a different light, with different obscurities, on a different trajectory, in a different project, totalized and totalizing in a new way, from logic to music, from mathematics to poetry, from first faltering steps to creative works, which does not exclude reflection, rejecting the Egg 25 static, pleasure close to pain, trance, death, to the inaccessible, becoming. It is this, a change in which everything changes, except the totality of changes, in a relationship that is paradoxical, but elucidated by what it implies and contains, what it degenerates into, by what it is generated, the repetitive, to be or not to be, no, word das du bist, become what you are, yes. By saying this yes, we have accepted the worst hypothesis, the terrifying one of eternal repetition of the same. In other words, the accidents that have made us ourselves, the circumstances that have produced our mediocre to human existence, but also, and by the same token, the marvelous one of the superhuman, which is born at this very moment, bringing the meaning of becoming. Two great lineages of philosophical thought converge here, intermingling with others, empiricism and rationalism, materialism and idealism, nominalism and conceptual realism, etc. The Eleatic and the Heraclitean. The ancient and modern Eleatics may deny the importance of motion, they cannot deny its existence without changing the celebrated paradoxes of Zeno into dogmas. As for the Heracliteans, they have to acknowledge the importance of at least cyclical repetition. Heraclitus already accepted it, with his great ear. The theory of universal becoming cannot refute the repetitive by relegating it to the merely apparent. The theory of the intelligible unmovable may appear to reject flux and chaotic movement, but it has to admit that becoming creates forms, determinate beings, genera and species that are named. What leaves room for the intervention of thought? The practical gesture, the repetitive. Every action assumes a repetition, as it is itself repeated. Gestures, aims. Philosophy has elucidated this feature of practical, technical, activity. According to Hegel, it is the analytical understanding rather than dialectical reason that is involved in practice, in work. For Marx, likewise, dialectical thought only discovers itself, and only discovers the real and its contradictions, by confrontation between the real and the possible, at the level of the totality. On the contrary, this in no way excludes the production of something new by the ensemble, totality, of reiterated gestures, repetitive acts, mechanical and technical interventions, which according to Marx form part of the productive forces that transform nature. If this is correct, how can we be surprised by the importance of the repetitive in the modern world, with its objects, products and gestures? The satisfaction of having generated by repetition the knowledge of this world and in this world does not suppress the unease, and we understand better why Nietzsche did not persist in constructing a system out of repetition, but created Zarathustra to overcome the nihilism inherent in modernity. We have sketched this system above, to show what the poet Nietzsche did not say. In itself it would be only one system among so many others that modern thought has elaborated since Hegel. Every systematic mind draws a masochistic pleasure from the prison in which it confines itself, by carefully drawing the bolts. Nietzsche, for his part, opens them with a 26 hammer. Indeed, but also with his blood. Modernity slipped into repetition, and consciousness of the repetitive, simultaneously revealed and masked by ideologies, pan-mathematism and pan-conceptualism, the fetishism of the combinatory and the structure, design and models, into etc. The modern era thus savors to the dregs the taste of repetition. The history from which it long believed it proceeded denied repetition or granted it only a weak part, in the name of a becoming both fetishized and rationalized. This monumental history collapses, like systematic philosophy, itself monumental, along with the justifications and legitimations that many people believed and still believe they can draw from it. Modernity has this double aspect. Everything changes and nothing changes. Everything shakes and everything stagnates. Is not the most crippling repetition that of tyranny? Revolution, in the name of liberty, has generated a resumption of the ancient despotisms, in an aggravated modern version. But repetition is not confined to the spheres of power and the state. It is massive. By the mediation of techniques, the importance of the repetitive, which Nietzsche revealed through a critique of history, historicism, evolutionism and the Hegelian philosophy of becoming, also through a rigorous analysis of poetry, music and tragedy, is thus being regularly confirmed. On all sides, critical analysis of everyday life shows the involvement of cyclical repetitions, hours, days and nights, weeks and months, seasons, needs, and linear repetitions, the gestures and actions of work, of family life, of social relations. Similarly, analysis of economic phenomena and, more widely, of the reproduction of social relations of production. This reproduction fundamentally banks on the generalization of the repetitive. If everything is repeated, then social relations automatically continue. By becoming automatic, by forming part of the general automatism, to the point that it is not just philosophy and knowledge that can be defined in terms of the conflictual relationship between repetition and becoming, nor modernity as ideological illusion, but the entire society. Everything weighs on one side towards reproduction, towards quantified repetition, and everyone comes to demand the new, the breakthrough, the qualitative leap forward, which does not come about. Hegel thus foresaw a state that generated its conditions of formation and equilibrium, a self-generating and self-reproducible system. Marx, on the contrary, foresaw in the name of the proletarian revolution a leap forward of becoming, a new generation, without repetition but without loss of the past. Nietzsche both denounced the danger of a repetition that would kill all difference and made the demand for a complete break that transcended the past. Here we see clearly the radical difference between Hegelian and Marxist supersession, which preserves antecedents and preconditions at a higher level by raising them, more so for Hegel, less so for Marx, and the Nietzschean supersession, which denies, rejects, disowns, belies, refutes, casts into the abyss. Optimistic Offerman and tragic Huber wind and confront one another, and with them difference and repetition, reproduction, how to choose, and is this necessary? 11. The discovery of imitation mimesis, as a mental and social phenomenon cannot be attributed to Nietzsche. He did not even think of making explicit. 27. Still less of systematizing, a theory of mimesis or mimicry. He showed its importance in a critical analysis, critical in the Nietzschean sense, sarcastic, rather than ironic or humorous. A Hegelian admires imitation as the rational power that stimulates the reproduction of a human, social or political type. As for the Marxists, and even Marx himself, they neglected such phenomena, leaving aside the theory of identity and change, metamorphosis, in other words, of repetition and difference, of imitation and creation. Nietzsche revealed the importance of mimesis in nature. No leaf of an oak tree is rigorously and absolutely identical to another, and yet all oak leaves resemble one another. The concept of leaf that retains only these resemblances and changes them into identity does not have the truth that the stubborn champions of knowledge attribute to it, and yet, such concepts make it possible for empirical consciousness, practical activity, to have their sphere, and for humans to dwell in a socio-political construction architecture. In the course of evolution, from the time a species of plant has existed until it disappears, each individual produces that from which it is born. Between oak leaves the differences are minimal, internal to the species characterized as a balanced system, each plant and the whole set of plants belonging to the genus constituting a whole. The oak and the oak leaves, its branches and its bearing, differ from the palm tree and its attributes. Here, difference makes a leap and becomes maximal. We could say the same when a new species arises, which confirms the distinction difference between differences induced within an ensemble, by repetition and mimesis, and differences produced outside of such an established system, when the system breaks up or metamorphoses. In society, the mechanism of mimesis is a double one. It proceeds by direct identification with the type or model, the enslaved, the subjected, the oppressed. The people of ressentiment identify with the strong man, the conqueror, the possessor and master. They reproduce him within themselves, with no intermediary. Thus children imitate their father, or subjects their prince, or soldiers their leader. Often mimesis proceeds indirectly, starting from an image or symbol, whether or not issued by a superior power. In an established church, each person indirectly imitates a saint, or rather, the image of one, and directly imitates the dignitary placed one step higher in the hierarchy. The analogical and the symbolic differ, but have the same effect, mimesis. This is how the comedy of the world goes, in which the best actor is the one who acts most sincerely. Words serve as instruments for this comedy, more concrete, real, than discourse. Moralist Laroche Foucault had long denounced the comedy of the world, but without studying its foundations and roots. In both cases, the mimetic process includes a simulation and yields simulacra, copies that are more or less accurate. According to Nietzsche and his followers, simulation is one of the mechanisms by which individuals insert themselves into a socio-political reality, and conversely by which society uses both discourse and schemas, symbols and images, to integrate individuals. The phenomenon thus has an enormous amplitude and a decisive weight in the reproduction of the summit of society by the base, without which the socio-political structure would collapse. The complexity of mimesis is increased by the fact that creation begins with imitation and cannot begin otherwise. The future creator makes their debut by choosing a father or a master, Wagner, for Nietzsche, from whom they then take their distance, executing them if need be, as a path of creation when a metamorphosis, a difference is produced. Mimesis may also block the way by sterilizing the procedure, leading instead to repetition. The mimesis phenomenon thus covers the entire socio-political field, including ethics and aesthetics, as well as fashion, education and various influences justified or not by representations, that is, by ideologies. Some strange realities derive from mimesis, halfway between appearance and metamorphosis. The mask, for example, as a simulacrum, it duplicates the face and conceals it. The L becomes another for itself, what it wants to become. Military uniform, generator of a mimesis supported by power, is a successful mask. Apprenticeship in a role made possible by a mask leads to duplication, or metamorphosis, or repetition and return to the acknowledged acknowledged identity. Lavatus prodia, advanced masked, is the motto of every innovator. The mask serves as shelter, alibi. One can get lost in a role, but only loss of identity makes change possible. The enemy is then identity, which attaches logic to mental, social, political reality. It makes possible fixation. Whoever says identity also says logic, tautology, system, vicious circle, circularity, repetition, reproduction of self and other, sterile mimesis, difference induced within an ensemble and reduced to the minimum. Mask and mark. Identity proceeds from trapped discourse and completes its work. Whoever says loss of identity also says mutation, metamorphosis, transvaluation, poetic creation. Between the two there is a distance, a dangerous journey. What is the risk? Bewilderment, madness, suicide. Certainly suffering and dissatisfaction. Identity brings the satisfaction of achieved being. In ownership, the Dionysian way is not at all rest. It is not the way of rest. The superhuman, maximal difference, is only achieved by undermining identity and bridging, overcoming, minimal differences. Discourse itself dissolves, and poetic practice invents a language, between On Truth and Lies written in 1873 and the Gay Science of 1882. Nietzsche discovered the world of identity behind that of mimesis and mask, as already described by the immoral moralists. Initially, he did not yet demand the possible impossible, the superhuman, but already he could not tolerate the world of image and mask, the comedy of the world of words and rhetoric. In short, social life according to the values imposed. Gradually, slowly, the horizon of metamorphosis, of absolute difference, opened before him. In dread, with a nameless anxiety, he discovered that aspiration to the greatest difference, to the superhuman, was not possible without accepting the most terrible identity, eternal recurrence. If there is metamorphosis, in other words, happy conjuncture and marvelous change, instead of limitless linear concatenation of causes and effects, reasons and consequences, if there is transmutation, then the same chance can produce any moment of the world. Metamorphosis can bring about the repetition of a fragment of becoming. The leap into the space of difference in science fiction terms, we could say into hyperspace, contains the absolute risk of total repetition. If a break with the accomplished is established, not a descentering in knowledge but a descentering in relation to knowledge by diving into the enigmatic depth of the Viku, above or below the surface and its mirror effects. Who knows what will happen on the other side of the mirror? Collapse, fall into the abyss, breakup of self-consciousness. The opening of the possible excludes no possibility. The best and the worst go together. Here again, if there is a Nietzschean dialectic, it differs radically from that of Hegel. There is no synthesis between the terms in play. What is born either reproduces what it is born from, keeping the identity of one of the terms, in a minimal difference, or else, leaping across an abyss, it transcends, at its own risks and perils. The tragedy of consciousness overflows the comedy of the world. The deepest contradictions brought to light may serve metamorphosis, which differs from them by an abyssal distance. Simply to cure those who suffer by removing their contradictions in the manner of psychoanalysis is to betray them. The Nietzschean aspiration thus implies fundamental rejection of the real as constitutive of the ego, the subject. Does Nietzsche take up in his own way the philosophical opposition of subjective and objective? No. His thought, his perspective does not involve philosophical categories. These terms belong to the identification that imprisons the possible. Beyond this realm of identity, of masks and images, of mimesis, beyond the realm of shadows, the sunny horizon beckons. Yet there is in the vision of eternal recurrence, a sense that can be expressed in philosophical terms of identity by return, repetition, and return of identity. What sense? That of nature and consciousness, of health and reflection, of innocence and cognition, a totality. 12. The meaning of the gay science is not exhausted in the repercussions detailed above. These almost systematized analyses simply have the aim of preventing a certain thought, which in modern times believes itself to be radical, from indefinitely repeating the journey Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, while failing to emerge from nihilism. Recommencing the path at its point of departure shows that no one in Europe has overcome nihilism. A failure on Nietzsche's part? Very likely. Until now, neither he nor we, Europeans, men of modernity, nor anyone has escaped from the realm of shadows. Another meaning of the gay science. There is nothing new without a provocation, a challenge, often dangerous and even increasingly so. No challenge without an aggression, an attack, and therefore without double risk, putting oneself in play, in question, banal formula, and engaging with those who are stronger than oneself, so as to bring them into play, into the stake. The Nietzschean radical negative acquires this guise and thus manifests in a movement, not in representation of movement, the contradictions inherent to the real. Otherwise it is simply an extension of learned discourse. Not everything that seeks to produce a meaning succeeds. Writing and literature are insufficient. Writing, not always mimetic, plays its role in reproduction more than in creation. Who does produce a meaning? The person who risks. Over the years, those who have produced meaning died from it and brought it to birth by their death. Socrates, Christ, madness, a different form of death, can have the same effect. The break with knowledge and power, the great redemption that inaugurates the leap into the possible, implies a break with philosophy as well as with everyday life. 13. Above society, above culture, something exists, certainly not the state, that we can call civilization. Cultural, educated Philistines believe they possess this as their public and private property. Society? This is a collection of social logics, in other words, of tautologies, circularities, systems great and small. Civilization is made up of values, in other words, of meanings, which live and die. It is within society that these values and meanings take shape and acquire their form. In the best of cases, such as Greece for example, or the Renaissance in Europe, a great civilization finds shape and strength, light, dancing, vigor, an elitist conception, yes, even if it gives the peoples, thus the masses, their share. There is no hierarchy of values, and so no higher values, that are not both accepted and resented by a people. The elite, the philosopher, the poet can only give form and force to what is germinating within the people, and conversely, peoples and poets can also put an end to higher values, killing philosophers and poets along with other heroes after engendering them. Socrates shows this, and Jesus still more so. Nietzsche's thought and perspective do not escape an ambiguity that we can see as fertile, as a philosopher, thinker and poet of a certain elitism, and thus appropriate for intellectuals who like to be marginal and set themselves apart, to make by their own means a life of hedonism or democracy, and, on the other hand, a philosopher of unflagging struggle against the state, against any manifestation of the will to power, against the logos that challenges the socio-political elitism. Why not? Perhaps liberty, that of the free spirit, has these two aspects today: to confront death while denying the death instinct, to affirm life. Is this not an ambiguity that transcends the traditional dualities and duplicities? Lucid, loving pleasure and joy without fear of suffering, playing without displaying, without promulgating a philosophy of play or a rule of the game, creating the total beyond the philosophy. This is the gay science. 14. A theory generally considered as Marxist, although it was Engels and Lenin rather than Marx who elaborated it as a theory of knowledge, declares that consciousness and knowledge are reflections. The majority of philosophers of knowledge have rejected this theory, except those who explicitly seek the warranty of Marxism. The theory of reflection is seen by philosophical opinion as crude. Indeed, Lenin wielded the metaphors of copy, photo and mirror rather 28 brutally. This theory, however, suits Nietzsche very well. He adopted it without reference to Marxism, of course both in the theoretical fragment of 1873 and in those fragments from a decade or more later designed to show the innocence of becoming. If thought and consciousness cannot be defined as a substance, the position of Descartes and many philosophers after him, including Hegel, if thought is not a being supplementary to being, in other words, if there is a difference between being and thought and yet thought corresponds to being, what can it consist of except a reflection? Reflection in the sense of thinking does indeed mean reflecting, unless this is merely a metaphor. But what is a reflection? Where does the mirror that reflects come from? Since a reflection has neither thickness, nor volume, nor weight, and is therefore unreal, what does a faithful reflection of the real consist in? Such a reflection, therefore, can only be understood as a form, that of a reflecting surface, which distorts the real in a determined manner. This is what Nietzsche says, turning as we have already seen the theory of reflection against the 29 naive thesis of a reflective fidelity: consciousness, a surface, reflecting and reflection, acts of the brain, along with language and logical form, but also of whole bodies, hands, sense organs, limbs, muscles, sex, because consciousness reflects, action metamorphoses the real, not being subject to any real substance, either outside or within. The reflection of cognition leaves open space for symbols, for poetic invention, for conceptual images. 15. Zarathustra declares a return and recourse to the body a source and resource, combining the force of poetry with theoretical declarations. As a return and recourse rather than a call for rescue, the body receives a completely different status compared to that which it had in a philosophy and society pervaded by Judeo-Christianity. Philosophy and religion have betrayed the body, especially in the West. European logos persists in reducing it, breaking it, mutilating it, below thought, the seat of the thought, but with a key and radical difference. There is the body. In what does this difference consist? If we insist on pursuing the interpretation of Nietzsche's poetry by translating it into prose, we have to say that this imprescriptible difference is not definable, because it intervenes and acts at every moment, including in the reflective consciousness that seeks to grasp it, an inexhaustible difference, at a distance both infinite and finite, between the ego and the body, which can be spelled out in 1001 ways, all necessary and none sufficient. Is the body the site of pleasure, this state or situation that has only a remote relationship with the situation of the person who knows and thinks? Yes and no. Philosophical hedonism does not get very far. The body suffers and enjoys. Suffering has as much meaning as pleasure, sometimes more. It proclaims a possibility, a productive crisis, a site occupied by affects, impulses, yes, but by many other things as well. The reason for acts that make for meaning and value yet have neither meaning nor value, such as the act of learning things, adhering to them, yes, but these philosophical words only say what the body is in relation to philosophical knowledge. For Nietzsche, the body contains depth. Indeed, it is the depth beneath the mirroring surface. 4. Poetry, or poiesis, height, luminosity, the Apollonian sphere, for consciousness, for knowledge, the surface dart for the body, the deep layers that the ray of analysis illuminates by piercing them like a dagger. The body, this misunderstood, unknown thing, brings with it limitless riches, rhythms, repetitions, cyclical and linearal, difference, from one age to the next, from the child to the adult in the drama of aging. It supersedes itself, precipitates the past into memory, enriches or impoverishes the entwining of its rhythms, develops or otherwise the ever-new relationship between needs and desire and consciousness and action. A return to hedonism, an adhesion to materialism, no, irreducible to philosophy. The Nietzschean recourse to the body does not see the body as machine. It opposes to this the body as energy, the body of poetry, music and dance. The negative determination, better than a definition that seeks to be positive by using philosophical language, makes it possible to enter into the Nietzschean perspective. The poet who speaks in Zarathustra wants to put an end to the separation between the mental, the social, the natural, and consequently to the dissociation between the word and the flesh. He seeks to change at the root the relationship of body to language, by no longer overvaluing language itself as abstraction. For Nietzsche there is no concrete abstraction, as with Hegel and Marx. He rejects this quasi-concept, which allows all moments to be given an analogous status, by bending them either to the side of the abstract or to that of the concrete. The concrete is the body, the abstract dart and hence language. Logic, for its part, is incorrigible and unable to renounce its formal abstraction without destroying itself, must be converted into the concrete, the body. There is nothing in common here with the corporeality of the philosophers. The status of the body, inasmuch as it can be described retrospectively in relation to logos, it has been perceived by some as the place and product of sin, the fall, dereliction, and conceived by others as a kind of carnal reserve, the irrational basis of the dominant rationality, useful as a use value that persist through exchanges and exchange values. Today, in a Nietzschean orientation, the contradiction is deepening. The whole weight of society falls on the body, adding to the pressures and constraints of the moral tradition the injunctions of performance, the proliferation of mutilating images, metaphorization into the visual, photography, cinema, the mass media, proceed to a dismembering of the body, a massive substitution of the body by the image, a shift from the physical to visual abstraction, a social transfer of energy to the spectacular. All this serves power, which manipulates concrete existence in this way. The fetishization of discourse and language provide the pretext for doing away with the body, with the result that the undermining of logos in the wake of its abuses of power can lead to its consolidation via the prestige of images of writing and of writings. To this degree, the alienation of Hegel and Marx acquires a changed character and significance. The deterioration of life threatens its vital foundation, the body. My children are here. Zarathustra has grown ripe. My hour has come. This is my morning. My day begins. Arise now, arise. Great noontide. Anything that affects the integrity of the body is attributed either to an obscure cause, the death instinct, or to a higher reason, the exigencies of knowledge in the modern world. In this way, the bourgeoisie is excused, and above all Judeo-Christianity and European logos, Greco-Latin in origin, a blind eye is turned to the tactical and strategic operations that attack the foundations of life, rationality and logos itself, that are proceeding to its self-destruction in the exacerbated modern world. The body living in total, establishes connections, desire and sense of value, movement and activity and object. This connection operates by way of play, dance, music, by theatre. It did in the past. Perhaps modern theatre, as discourse and spectacle, no longer has the virtues of its antique forerunner. The gap between signifier and signified inherent in discourse is aggravated into fractures and lets each of the two elements of the sign go its own way, unless the body, speech, voice and gesture re-establish the link. The subjectal, philosophical interrogation coming from the philosophers but calling for a reply duplicated. On the one hand, there is the abstract subject, which is to be attacked and dissolved. This is no longer the rational, Cartesian subject, thinking subject, nor the subject of knowledge, the Kantian subject, seat of the categories, nor the subject of linguists. It is the subject of power, with its investments and disguises, investissements et travestissements, and its myths, the father and the paternal, property and patrimony and possession, the superego and the supermale, etc. At the summit, the absolute abstract subject, the state. This sanctifies the empirical existence of the lesser subjects of power, and of those who subject others. In this domain, myths are completed by fictions. The ell of thought is linked to the ell of the citizen political and legal fiction, to the ell of the witness and the ell of the judge moral fiction, to the ell of discourse, grammatical fiction, etc. This empirical existence has its functions in its own domain, the relational, the situational, functional discourse as such. It can be an amusing exercise to deconstruct these. Zarathustra does not deprive himself of this pleasure. All subjects, including the superior man, constantly complain of the difficulty of being, the loss of identity, leading to a litany of discontents and complaints on the part of the subject. Fundamentally and irreconcilably opposed to power is the concrete subject, the body that conceals unsuspected treasures, and not just pleasure or erotic games, a fallacious interpretation, nor simply what psychoanalysis interprets as a symptom. It does not contrast with the abstract as the untamed to the sophisticated another fallacious interpretation of a far broader indictment. The body when denuded is not just an object of scandal. Modernity, stupefied by the absence of the body, has tried every escape route, every false exit, for want of having understood the gay science and Zarathustra. Sex, whether masculine or otherwise, is a part of the body with no right to set itself up as an appreciation and value, no more and no less than has work, or knowledge. Perhaps it is wrong to localize the erogenous in an organ or zone of the body. Doesn't the whole body feel erogenous? The presence of creative eros, before the signs of non-body and extra-body are deployed. Should the body be ascribed a new status? This way of putting the question remains naive. What status? Philosophical? Philosophy does not go beyond an essence, corporeality. Theoretical? Epistemological? With pure theory, the theoretical man, and epistemology, logos tends to sanction the eviction of the body. Status is not enough to repudiate the fragmentation of the body, the localization and dissociation of its functions, gestures, rhythms, by the division of labor. The mosaic body, counterpart or counterpoint of a mosaic knowledge, the body in pieces, only rediscovers its integrity when its status is changed, its theoretical or even social status. Psychoanalysis has sought to determine a status for the body, as a discipline that is specialized yet bound up with a clinical practice. What a failure. The space-time of the body, as depicted by psychoanalysts who seek to discern this, is reduced to the silence before and after speech, to the mortal difference that emerges from one hiatus between impulse and discourse, and produces another hiatus, castration. This is the space-time of death. Nothing is more opposed to the Nietzschean affirmation, to the transmutation of decadence, nihilism, into a yes to life, and therefore to the total body. The total body presents itself at the same time as virtuality and as actuality. For the psychoanalysts, it has no existence as a totality. For many, the body is duplicated into an organic order and an impulsive order. For these and some others as well, the unity of the body is represented only in the symbolic and the imaginary, the body of the subject, and that of the other as the site of the ensemble of signifiers, never joined together, disarticulated in principle by verbal expression, fragmented by sex. The body only rediscovers its unity by abandoning itself 50 to immortal ecstasy. For some analysts, only the mirror, material and sensory effect, thus immediate and localized in immediacy, reveals its non-fragmentation to the subject fragmented by sex and discourse. The body as totality, the clean body, site and subject of appropriation, presents itself only in the body of the mother, first of all, then in the fantasy of identification with the other. The image of the total body figures the illusory plenitude destined to be fissured by the death drive and arising from inadequacy. The object that is privileged among all others, the phallus, enables the masculine object to pass from being to having. Even though the law is fundamental parental division, foundation of the law of the father, obstructs him from this. The result is that castration, the paternal speech that executes, kills, the body in motion, intervenes sooner or later, the phallus, meeting place of law and logos, but also sight of their separation, arouses the vain fantasy of their reconciliation. Nietzsche calls for subversion, revolt, the revolution of the body. A status? No, at most one could say that the body, in Nietzsche's texts, is described or inscribed at several levels, like language. First of all, the empirical, the body object. At this level, the body studies itself, analyses itself, scientifically but also in an everyday way. This level includes the functional, the relational, the situational, then, the socio-political level. The body subjects as foundation of judgments, values that are often negative, blame, humiliation, and metaphorizations, by language. With the growing primacy of the readable visible, the body does not govern production, and yet this is done with the body and for bodies. At this level, the body plays a role not of transgression but of transmission of knowledge and reproduction of social relations, even though these weigh on it. Finally, then, the poetic level, that of unity regained via the test of dissociation, poetic speech, and in no way original or terminal speech, that of a god, true by its essence seeks the unity of the body and the display of its riches. Poetic speech exorcises death, the death drive, by the tragic. Instead of giving in to this, it manages to conquer the dangers of discourse and writing, renewing both poetry and music by the rhythms of the body, by the repetitive and the differential as in the body. According to Nietzsche, poetic practice means appropriation, as a possibility both near and distant. This concept or appropriation, speculatively conceived by Hegel, the restitution of the idea in the state, is only weakly determined in Marx. The poet Nietzsche opens the horizon of appropriated desire and body. First of all, for the individual to appropriate their own body, and for the human species to appropriate the total body, nature and conquests of multiform activity, hence space. This does not exclude the symbolic and the imaginary, without banking on them alone, and it does not exclude the ideological, starting with the philosophically sanctioned separation of soul and body, spirit and matter without going so far, like Hegel, as to fetishize the identity of the real and the rational. Poetic practice is revealed in music and dance, works of life and vitality, glorious body no, concrete body, presence and sight of presence, but virtuality is revealed totality. 16. By way of poetry, Nietzsche introduced into Eurocentric logos some explosive assertions, true and false, full of meaning, absurd. These terms and categories are no longer suitable, but they can be used to expound Nietzsche's assertions. These bear first of all on finitude. For philosophy, for Hegel, reflection leads to awareness of the finite, things, life, human reality. In Hegelianism, the struggle and war between states has the function that each moment, each individual, recognizes their finitude by experiencing it. The state survives in the milieu of these struggles of nations. It alone asserts itself here. Outside of the idea and the state, the infinite for Hegel is only a bad infinity, unbounded, undetermined. 31. For Nietzsche, we are infinite. As for Spinoza, through thought, knowledge, consciousness, no, through the body, each body, and thus our own, yours, mine, because it is in time and space, contains the infinite, infinite space, the cosmos, and time, the world, imply one another and refract, each in its way, the infinite universe. A living body is at the same time a macrocosm, human bodies in relation to cells, molecules and atoms, and a microcosm, in relation to the galaxy. The infinite is everywhere, before the finite. There are both qualitative and quantitative differences between a little living body on the earth on the one hand and the sun on the other, but each draws cosmic energy and focuses this in order to expend it. Time and space, maximally different yet indissociable, are joined at every place and every instant, every moment. To distort the Hegelian term, music expresses this infinity, that of the body, of desire, of silence, which, finite, language does not manage to declare. Each place and each instant relate to the totality of space and time. The living body, yours, mine, has a double and elusive origin. The germ, maternal-paternal, referring to a genealogical lineage, and the species, life as a whole. The earth, referring to the entire cosmos. Each series of assignable causes and effects becomes lost in the night, which arouses ontological nostalgia, nostalgia for the origin. Each series refers to the other, the genealogical lineage to cosmological becoming and vice versa. The palpable and the unfathomable go hand in hand. The unfathomable is the bottom, the depth, chaos. The palpable is the surface, skin, the glance, the mirror, the meeting of time and space in a moment, place and instant. On the one hand, height, space. On the other, the abyss, timeliness. In the body, it follows that infinity is the initial, original fact. What has to be explained is where the finite comes 32 from. In infinite time and space there is no finite, are the finite and the infinite not just effects of perspective for the Dasein. Better to affirm the poetic priority of the infinite over the finite, the primacy of joy, the finite and the sense that common sense has it. In other words, things that are clearly distinct and separate, that can be counted and used, is no more than appearance. Philosophers have understood this, and they have even named the conviction of a unity of things dialectical. They have not carried this discovery to its final conclusion. The finite is only appearance, but appearance is not separated from the real. Universal energy is concentrated in countless centers and foci, expending itself in places and moments, diversifying into countless phenomena. Phenomena relative to these centers and foci repeat themselves, and all expenditures of energy differ. Space and time are only discerned by being encountered in a here and now. The body thus contains the unity and constant becoming of the infinite and the finite. It has the infinite within it. It is of the finite. As a consequence, necessity is both as true and as false as chance, and repetition as true as difference. On the inaccessible scale of the universe, the formidable necessity of space-time reigns. Difference dominates, since universal energy is expended in ever new fulgurations. On our own scale, chance and repetition dominate, just as each thing can be analyzed into time and space, and resolved into effects and cause, so that scarcely one line of effects and causes is self-sufficient and can be isolated, so does each body resolve into a conjunction of chances. Ego is born of a chance encounter, and if ego still lives, this is a matter of chance. A shock, a virus, a gust of wind, could have carried it away, not counting various other chances. In the finite, chance and the repetitive go together. A conjunction of chances may always reappear. If I conceive time in the manner of historical time, a cold and rigid line, a thread stretched from the past to the future, I'll immediately have to restore the reappearance of figures, that is cycles and linear concatenations that are repeated. The species and childhood, life and death, sleep and waking, work and rest, or again, the violent and the peaceful, the adventurous and the contemplative, etc. Chance and the conjunctions of chances that realize partial determinisms, along with the repetition of particularities, impose once again the formidable image concept vision of eternal 33 recurrence. The body, emerging from becoming, space-time, immersed in chances, good and bad, is situated at the center of poietic vision and practice. Concrete reason, center and reference, not stable, not condemned to an ungraspable becoming, but producer of its own becoming, and besides, set on encounters that the will learns to divert and evade for its own use. 17. Loss of identity. This is the tragedy of the situation. Alienation, an alienation effect. No, this judgment is no longer sufficient. Loss of identity, the condition for metamorphosis, can be rejected. Then identity, and thus repetition, has the upper hand, when loss of identity accepts itself as the dangerous path of a metamorphosis. Hence a difference. Dionysian intoxication rules. Life in the highest degree makes use of two procedures. Dionysian intoxication, sought in isolation, leads to lawless adventure, to drugs, eroticism, abandonment to the madness of the moment, and at the same time to the disintegration 34 of the self in the pursuit of transcendence. Memory and cognition make it possible to break, to control metamorphosis to a certain extent, at the risk of preventing it. Apollo by itself contains the danger of a different dissolution. Unity in the contrast and confrontation of these two powers is the path chosen by Nietzsche. 18. We have been able to show the principled antagonism, as radical as possible, between Hegelian philosophy and Nietzsche's metaphilosophical thought. It is a pleasant exercise, then, to sketch the intersection between the Marxist, revolutionary, project and the Nietzschean, subversive perspective. The common ground is opposition to Hegel, shared, therefore, are, atheism, the idea of nature, matter, energy, as the basis of all existence, b, a critique of Hegel's political theodicy, the state and the reproduction within the state of history, the past, moments and social relations. This implies a critique of language, of logos bound up with logic and language, as well of Hegelian historicity. D, the rejection of Judeo-Christianity, in Marx, from his text on the Jewish question, and in the whole of Nietzsche's work, above all and beyond good and evil, the idea of the senses and the body becoming theoretical. Cf. Marx's 1844 manuscripts and Nietzsche's Zarathustra, not forgetting the gay science, which implies the rejection of any system. F. The project and perspective of production, creation, of a totally new reality, even while retaining moments of the past epist, which includes the destruction of the actual more pronounced in Nietzsche, less violent in Marx. G. The idea that the essential, the creative, is found neither in the economic realm as such nor in politics as such, which implies the rejection of both the state and politics in favor of relations that Marx calls social and Nietzsche calls human, then superhuman. After this table of agreements, here are the divergences. For Nietzsche, the words God is dead have a tragic repercussion, far wider than atheism and naturalism. B. For Nietzsche, rationality, historical in Hegel, industrial in Marx is not just limited but illusory, and along with it therefore truth in the sense of the philosophers. Nietzsche's idea of creation, by poetry, by metamorphosis, differs from Marx's idea of production, even though both derive from the body and its activity by generating relations, connections. D. For Nietzsche, civilization is far more important than society, and infinitely more so than the state. It is defined by way of individuals and individual actions, by evaluations, values, and a hierarchy of values, far more than by the level of growth and social development or by the productive forces, viewed quantitatively and qualitatively, poetry and art as paths, instead of knowledge as Marx still maintains, hence creative work above product. F. Superseding idebasment, destruction, Überwinden, rather than elevation, or Verben, which includes, as already said, tragedy and radical subversion, heedless of the result. The past is appreciated as decadence and not as resource, maturation, preparation of the possible. The divide between the past, the present and the possible is thus far deeper for Nietzsche than is the political break with the state for Marx, is seen as for Nietzsche. Therefore, there is not a transition but a perilous leap. The past, the actual Europe, capitalism and the bourgeoisie, the existing world, is destroying itself. For Marx and Marxists, these have to be helped to avoid catastrophe or harakiri. For Nietzsche and Nietzscheans, it is better to drive the decadent to suicide. Nietzsche's work can be presented as a right-wing critique of the reality, the West and the westernized world, European logos, the bourgeoisie and capitalism, productivism and economism, etc., to which Marx had applied a left-wing critique. This is an unfair simplification. A few years after the acme or apogee of Marx and his work, Nietzsche arrived at the moment of initial disappointments. With Marx already on the decline, he drew the consequences. The old world continued. Renewal was delayed. Why? How to attack the real? It had consolidated itself and rigidified according to the Hegelian model. It can be said that the problematism of Marxism, even its aphoretic character, is replicated by the Nietzschean problematic. To break class society by class struggle, help the working class to supersede by negating it, destroy the state after undermining its political apparatuses. True, if this is possible and as soon as it is possible. But this then raises the question of power, hardly broached by Marx and eluded by 35 official Marxist thought. Now, Nietzsche brings this question to the full light of day, in complete lucidity. He detects these relations of force, these powers with their implications of oppression, exploitation, humiliation, where they are not perceived, where they are lived without knowing it. The most frightening consequence is this: human beings too often end up loving and worshipping those who have power over them, imitating them and identifying with them, experiencing pleasure in humiliation. Logos, Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian, revised by Descartes and by Hegel on the philosophical level, made more sophisticated on the political level by the modern state, becomes a complicated instrument with a single aim, the reproduction of the relations of production. Marx stopped short in the face of this situation and these problems. Nietzsche contributed a radical critique of power, going further than the Marxist critique of the state itself neglected. A neo-Nietzscheanism would quickly become elitist. A Nietzschean or pseudo-Nietzschean system would rescue the old philosophy that quickly put itself in the service of the state, forming part of the play of powers. Nietzsche's thought, therefore, does not escape from ambiguity, from the realm of shadows. Today, under Nietzschean influence, a certain elite sees it as inelegant and outdated to talk of capitalism, the bourgeoisie, reproduction or Marx, Nietzsche, or rather a simulation of Nietzscheanism, can thus recover. Understanding of poetic practice refutes and prevents this recuperation by the elite, by knowledge. For Nietzsche proclaimed the end of declining, decadent, Western values and the genesis of new relationships between the body and consciousness, thus between the body and language, the conceived and the experienced, the serious and the frivolous, knowledge and non-knowledge, life and death. A Nietzschean orientation calls for catastrophe. A Marxist orientation seeks rather to limit the damage. What catastrophe? That of the end of ends, various deaths, God, man, history, capitalism, the state, and, subsequently the human species and even life on planet Earth. Conclusion and afterword 1. Who to choose? A rather naive and crude question, which asserts that everyone has to choose and even has already chosen, although they can modify this choice of pilot, direction and horizon. Let us summarize the perspectives. Hegel, meaning and reality, in complete agreement to the point of being identical, arise from the accomplished, the historical past, the acquired, and thus for Hegel the true history, already finished. A solid thought to which anyone might attach themselves, a model of reality and an exemplar of coherent discourse. The Hegelian system generates a mimesis, comfortable or fascinating depending on who it is that seeks this attachment. Even if unaware of it, systematic minds, who place cohesion and order above all else, are Hegelians. Hegelianism is a stable block, a certainty, to be taken or left. What is there to add to its detailed, pedagogic and political study? Details, improvements, minor perfections, which satisfy the great majority of those with a penchant for the established order, for fitting into the given space, and moreover, with at least as many openings as differences. Remark, in Hegel's time, his philosophico-political system had something utopian about it. Its logical realism subordinated every feature, moment or member, of social production to a harmonious totality, a finality that was diachronic, in time, and synchronic with the end of historical time. By what right? All Hegel had to legitimize his construction were analyses of the French state, monarchical, then Jacobin, then Napoleonic, still incomplete, and the Prussian state, still in its infancy as a modern state. From these realities Hegel was able to discern the essential features. By emphasizing these, he honed the concept of the state, a positive utopia in the early 19th century in opposition to the negative utopias of the socialists. Fourier, Saint Simon, the fact that, a century and a half later, the state utopia is realized practically throughout the world, and still in opposition to other utopias. Negative, Fourier, or technological I Saint Simon, gives cause for reflection. Is this not a serious, if not a decisive reason, for giving Hegel the laurel wreath, as the sole philosopher to have succeeded in transforming his doctrine of utopia into a model? Marx, meaning reveals itself in the future. Marx sought to unite the real and the possible, science based on the past history and opening towards the future. Neither messianism nor knowledge established as such. Marxist thought presupposes the meaning of the possible and supports this with naturalist arguments. Everything that exists is born, grows, dies, and society too. An analogous paradox. Marx describes the genesis, analyses the actuality and explains the becoming of a concrete abstraction, commodities and money, presenting the laws of exchange of goods, products, as natural laws, in a way that offers the only hope of a breakthrough, the only chance, by way of the harsh reality of established fact. What opens the path of the possible? Who beats the path to the future? Labor and the workers. This path is marked by a number of ends that give it its meaning, including the end of bourgeois society, the end of the state, the end of history, etc. The possibles are thus both unlimited and defined by these ends, finality and meaning. The working class and its action, far from driving towards quantification, endless growth of the present elements of society, increase in size of the constitutive moments, advances on the path of the qualitative. It rejects the past to create and produce new qualities, relationships that are ever richer. The various ends are only qualitative, leaps along this path. Analysis of the real, by differentiating the quantitative and the qualitative, does not hesitate to attribute quality to the total revolution. This total revolution, though divided into distinct phases and movements, has as its starting point proletarian revolution and its active development, both free and determined. Not because freedom consists in cognition of a pre-existing determination, but because it develops the determinations while diversifying, differentiating them. Openings onto the future, milestones along the way, correspond to determinations and tendencies, not to determinisms. Nietzsche, like Marx, the poet Nietzsche revealed and denounced some monstrous metamorphoses, starting with that which made circumstantial results of history into metaphysical truths, and made the body into images and ideas. History is disqualified, meaning comes neither from the past nor from the future. Where is it sought? Where does it reveal itself? In the present. Value is applied to the present, giving this meaning by valuing it, even the values of faith and theology, belief and morality, even the values of history. Now, these values and meanings are dead, all of them, From where then can value and meaning arise today? From sticking to the vécu, lived experience, not to accept it but, on the contrary, to metamorphose it by the force of adhesion, to transfigure the vécu into vivre, living. Grasping the present reveals its depth, no longer bound up with origin and end, with theological and philosophical questions. The body turns out to have been unknown and misunderstood, with the exception of Spinoza. Philosophers since Socrates had ignored the body and its riches, its organs as bearers of meanings and values. Only Spinoza grasped the identity of the conceived, the perceived, the lived. The body contained far more than a space filled with a material, it contained the infinite, the eternal. Other philosophers, in their metaphorizing, had ignored the body on their way towards abstraction, the pure legible visible. What then is the superhuman? To define it as a projection or a project, a hope or a desire in the usual sense of the word, is a philosophical error, which metaphorizes the superhuman, aesthetically or ethically. When Hegel, contradicting himself, proposed that the creative consciousness should entrust itself to absolute difference, grasped in its being there, cf. Phenomenology, he presaged Nietzsche's contention. The superhuman is nothing more than adhesion to the present, with the result that the body gives a glimpse of what it contains. Chances and determinisms, repetitions and differences, rhythms and reasons, Dionysus and Apollo. Suffering has as much meaning as joy and pleasure. Night has as much meaning and more depth than day. Death that return more than life, as poets have understood better than philosophers, and differently from theologians. Adhesion, the yes, creates the maximal difference, the superhuman, while having the air of denoting a minimum difference. Acceptance, a more fatty, in the Stoic sense. The meaning of the yes and the start of the superhuman is everything and right away, which implies the terrible test of return. The all, the present grasped as all, can return. The gay science does not falter against this vision. It tests and verifies itself in it, too. But do we really have to choose? On closer examination, very close, of each element, the reasons for choice disappear and collapse. Hegel is the state, nothing but the state, only state, and the state fastened to its pale real, or at least realized since Hegel. But does the state as modern reality coincide with the Hegelian state? This has the grand appearance of a castle. The modern state looks more like a large bourgeois house. The main buildings flanked by a number of dependencies, shops, workshops, rubbish tips. The grand style has gone. Nothing remains of the fine rational construction except the lack of horizon, the stifling. Since Hegel's time, the bureaucracy has revealed its essence. Its tyrannical and complicated performances more clearly than its competences. Bureaucratic knowledge and brute force. Those are the two faces of the state, for Hegel and in Hegelianism. Knowledge triumphs. Knowledge and power harmonize to the point of being identified with reason, in an initial and final trinity. In the modern society and state, on the other hand, what do statesmen need? Information more than cognition. For what aim? The manipulation of men, crowds and individuals. Which relieves the state of the humanist pretext that it still had for Hegel. Science, or rather, the sciences, these find their place in the apparatuses of production and control. Knowledge as such, it is relegated into a ghetto, the university. For information, statesmen have their services, their teams. In relation to them, knowledge functions as a databank. Cognition, then, is frozen into institutional knowledge, and relegated to a margin instead of occupying the center. As for Hegel, this does not prevent it from a double use, in materiality, production, and in ideality, politics. It serves and does not reign. In short, the state, ever more a brute force, makes use of knowledge. To accept the Hegelian conception means agreeing to place oneself at the service of the state, in other words, of the leaders of the state, selected, the wrong way round, by their own apparatuses. Those competent in this or that, those with knowledge, form councils and become councillors of princes. Those competent in nothing, but who show particular skill in manipulating people and using skills, become political leaders, modern princes, with the risks and perils attached. Marx, his postulate of the possible is hard to verify. It rests on a fragile basis, the analogy between nature and society. As in nature, there is a maturation of social beings, critical points of growth, then decline and death. Death may be heralded in advance, predicted, by analyzing indications and symptoms. Contradictions. This postulate, generalized to classes, rising, declining, nations, societies, to the state and to states, to modes of production, is not consolidated as truth, as acquired knowledge, on the so-called epistemological level. As for seeking where and how Marx contributed to theory, to cognition, this is not to be sought in this naturalist philosophy of history, but rather in Marx's economics, surplus value, or his history in the strict narrow sense, the genesis of social formations, including capitalism and the bourgeoisie. For Marx, a new rationality, qualitatively superior to philosophical rationality, is born from social practice at a given point in time, from industry and labor. Now, this presupposition, not very explicit, is no more verified than is the naturalist postulate that aligns social life with natural life. Is it correct that Marx received from the rising bourgeoisie, by the mediation of the English economist and Hegel, the notion of labor as valuable? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that he recognized, as Smith and Hegel had done, the importance of production. No, in the sense that he held that an original reason or rationality arose from labor, not yet spelled out by the English economist and Hegel, but more strongly and with broader perspective by the great Frenchmen, Fourier and Saint Simon. That said, the division of labor, until now not surmounted even if not insurmountable, has shattered this optimistic theory. The superseding of labor is not being brought about by a polytechnicism, multifunctionality of the worker, but by automation, something that Marx had sensed without perceiving the inevitable shattering of the values and meaning of labor that has resulted from it today. But this is nothing alongside the political paradox inherent to Marxist thought. Struggle on the political level to put an end to politics, to lead the state to wither away. A specific but surprising dialectic is that the working class, for Marx, asserts itself by negating itself. It supersedes itself by superseding capitalism. Does this dialectical assertion not contain a risk, the loss of momentum and identity, the withering away of the working class itself? Nietzsche? What risks? If the superhuman begins here and now, in jubilant adhesion to the act, to the body in the present, where does it lead me? Where does someone end up if they do not enter the realm of the will to power, and yet grasp the depth of this will, with its diversities, masks, travesties, in a wandering with no assigned direction, towards heterology, without managing to escape the question of the language or support to adopt, or not, for this reality, avoiding conventional metaphors that have entered the language? What is the risk of returning to a poetic naturalism, in which sun and night, thunder and lightning, sea, lakes and winds, led a great prophetic dance? The greatest risk is that of constructing an elite that sees itself as a new aristocracy, masters without slaves, etc. Egotism, egocentrism. These criticisms of Nietzschean living are without foundation. The subject rebuilt on new bases has nothing in common with the old ego. The accusation of elitism, on the other hand, does have an impact. This elite would cultivate its art of living within the existing society, using its resources, without seeking subversion and destruction otherwise than on the level of writing literature, separate in appearance, subversive in illusion. This elite would have no hold on the real, save by way of discourse and writing. Such a caste, unable to become a class, remains marginal in relation to people who act and have wealth and power, or both. In short, Nietzscheanism runs the risk of reaffirming what Nietzsche hated, the intellect, the intelligentsia, ghettos, turnstiles, verbal negativism have not put an end to nihilism, and do not seem designed to do so. Something about Nietzsche's poetry recalls the quest for the Grail, in the version of Wolfram von Eschenbach, where the Grail is not a sacred vessel, a holy cup, but a magic object, a talisman, a precious stone, conferring superhuman powers on its possessor. We might reply by refuting the parodies and caricatures of Nietzscheanism. Today, the Nietzschean would practice both discretion and prudence. He would abstain from speaking too much, and above all from writing. He would seek to live and express himself in actions full of meaning. But what criterion enables us to distinguish poetic practice as recommended by Nietzsche from its parody, in an age when mimesis plays a dominant role? 3. Which saint to devote oneself to? And if there is no saint, no luminous figure, if there are no stars above the shadow, shall we go and look elsewhere, in the company of the guides of shadow, the gurus, the griots, in other words the psychoanalysts, the modern neo-philosophers, the inspud, excluding the second crass hypothesis? What remains of the confrontation? This, rather than choosing, the three moments should each be kept in mind. To choose, in the customary fashion, would mean adopting the one and dismissing the others. Why not simultaneously? Hegel, Hegelianism, with the reality it represents. This is a given of action, the obstacle and enemy that can only be combated with its own weapons. If something has been shown, it is indeed the fascinating and adverse character of Hegelian doctrine, not so much as doctrine, but as the truth of an intolerable reality that blocks the way, an unavoidable double action, on the theoretical and the practical level, aims, on the one hand, at Hegelian doctrine and, on the other hand, at what this expresses, the state that has set itself up and imposed itself, indefinitely persevering in its being if it is allowed, if we accept, with Hegel and the Hegelians, that being, in the philosophical sense finds its code and its deciphering, its elucidation and its accomplishment, in the state. Marx indicated the objective possibility of a breakthrough, a social and political possibility, which only a revolutionary class could carry out, the working class, if it asserts itself as political subject, and to the extent that it does so, if it is true that this assertion has never been accomplished massively and decisively, something is always happening somewhere or other that maintains this meaning. In other words, the production of new relations and objective differences. Nietzsche indicated the subjective possibility of a breakthrough by displaying what is contained in the pure act, initial and final, adhesion to the present, in human body, a yes to life. This leads to a poetic practice, creator of subjective differences. 4. By way of an afterword to this confrontation, here are a few deliberately subjective aspects. Why insert them here? To show the importance of Nietzsche as revealer, in terms closer to knowledge, as a person who expressed meanings and values, thus the universal decoder and thereby destroyer of codes, requiring either the invention of a different code, or the superseding of coding decoding. The present writer read Nietzsche as the result of pure accident, at the age of about 15, during a Christian education, everything that was then translated, plus some texts in German. Zarathustra, the book you believe you have already read on first reading, but believe you are always reading it for the first time, the book that redeems, yes, but it is a symptom of the era. Then comes the effort to return to the norm, work, practice, history, action. Given the extreme difficulty experienced by an adolescent in creating his own life and contradictorily, the effort to join a revolutionary or subversive movement, capable of effective action, at 25 years old. Therefore, despite the Nietzschean dazzle, a shadow among shadows, and even the very embodiment of shadow, struggling with not just one shadow, hence the encounter first of all with Hegel, again by puriest chance, on the desk of Andre Breton, then with Marx. Hence also misunderstanding, adhesion to Marxism because of a capital theory, that of the withering away of the state, hence joining the French Communist Party PCF, a movement that was inevitably frozen in Stalinism and fetishism of the state, hence a number of diversions done in the course of these diversions, and while slowly finding my way to the light, the idea of a double breakthrough never disappeared, by way of politics and the critique of politics, to supersede this as such by way of poetry, eros, symbol and imaginary, by the refusal of distortion and alienation, and by grasping the present. 5. The objective, socio-economic, breakthrough and the subjective, poetic, breakthrough meet up together in space. It is in a space that differences are inscribed and still more are realized, from the least to the most extreme, unevenly illuminated, unevenly accessible, bristling with obstacles, and itself an obstacle in the face of initiatives, shaped by these, space becomes the site and milieu of differences. The test of conflicts and the test of space tend to coincide. For everything that asserts itself and seeks a breakthrough, objective or subjective, is this project of space, the task on a planetary scale of a double productive and creative activity, aesthetic and material, the empirical substitute for the superhuman, a replacement product? No, it implies a superseding, überwinden, on the scale of the world, casting the dead results of historical time into abolition. It contains a concrete test, bound up with practice and the totality of the possible, according to Marx's most radical thought, bound up too with the entire restitution of the palpable and the body, according to Nietzsche's poetry. This project rejects into the nothingness of dead results the Hegelian space, the work of the state, where this establishes and displays itself. As the work and product of the human species, space emerges from the shadow, like a planet emerging from an eclipse. Note 3 stars, 1 constellation. Introduction to Hegel. Marx, Nietzsche 1 Hegel. Marx, Nietzsche, Au Le Royaume des Ombres, Paris, Casterman, 1975. La Production de l'espace. Translated by Donald Nicholson Smith as The Production of Space. Oxford, Blackwell, 1991. Deliatet, Paris. Huge, 4 volumes, 1976-8. The last of